biggest thing was just getting people to hear my side. I want this abuse to stop. It's just, enough is enough.
He's got a towel just kind of covering his mouth that's secured by duct tape, and he's handcuffed.
Revenge is a very motivating factor in a lot of things you do in life, and you know, when it escalates to murder, it's pretty extreme.
What people didn't know is what was happening behind the scenes.
You keep on doing something to somebody, you know, over and over and over again. In due time, yes, they are gonna snap.
On July 27th, 2007, police in Queens, New York receive a mysterious call from a frantic young woman.
Police operator 1937, where's the emergency?
Somebody's bleeding to death. Please send an ambulance.
The woman reports that there's someone bleeding to death on a third-floor apartment.
What's the phone number there, please? You're calling me from?
There's no phone number.
And she hangs up, giving no further details.
Within minutes, police and paramedics arrive at the address and rush upstairs. At the same time, the 911 dispatcher traces the number and gets the caller back on the line.
Someone called for the police at 4:30. I did. Well, that's where the police are now, coming to the third floor. There. Who's there? His name is Eric.
Once again, the caller hangs up before providing more information.
When police show up to the scene, the door was wide open, and they find a man laying on the floor in handcuffs and gagged.
But the woman who called wasn't present.
He's got a towel just kind of covering his mouth that's secured by duct tape, and he's handcuffed and non-responsive at that point.
Paramedics tried CPR, but it was too late. The gentleman was already dead and pronounced dead on the scene.
They're able to ID the man as Eric Goodridge, who's someone very well known within the community and a prominent businessman from Liberia.
Eric Goodridge was born and raised in Liberia, but in his 20s, he left to start a new life in America with his girlfriend, Lucy Ann Harris, and her children.
Eric and Lucy migrated to the United States from Liberia with the two boys and settled down in the Staten Island area of New York, where there's a large population of Liberians.
Eric worked hard to get ahead. By the early 1980s, he was running a successful limousine service and an import-export company. He and Lucy also added 4 more children to their family. Unfortunately, the good times wouldn't last.
Despite how successful Eric was at providing for his family, his relationship with Lucy had its dark side. Because not long after the youngest child was born, he started a relationship and left the family for another woman.
Lucy struggled to raise the children on her own. And in 1983, she made a decision that changed all of their lives.
Lucy went to her grandfather's funeral in Liberia.
Mom left when I was 2, and she left on a laissez-passer, which is a cheaper form of a passport, and she didn't get her green card or her citizenship when she was here. So she wasn't allowed to come back, even though she had 6 children here.
The children basically bounced around to various foster homes till Eric came and took them in.
So my very first memory is I was in foster care, and I remember being on top of a bunk bed. I remember looking down and somebody was saying, "You're going to your new home." I was going back to my dad.
Eric's new wife became the children's stepmother, but work continued to pull him away.
Growing up as a kid, I just knew that my dad had a lot of money. He was well off. You know, he had a travel agency, import-export company, record studio. He did fairly well.
He was an entrepreneur. He had like a limousine company, a real estate, but he just traveled a lot.
Also secretive, very secretive. A lot of things that was just swept under the rug. But he did have a lot of people that loved him. You know, he did a lot for people.
In 1990, Eric returned to his home country to take a job with the Liberian Ministry of Transport, while the kids stayed with their stepmom in the States. When his temporary gig extended for months, his family once again fell apart.
At some point, my stepmother got tired of him and divorced him, and then she didn't want to take care of us, which is understandable. I don't blame her either. And she sent us to his family. So that's when we moved to Providence, Rhode Island to live with my aunt and grandmother, which is his sister and mother. But they were mad because Eric left us in their care and they had to take care of us, and he wasn't giving them money to take care of us.
In February 1994, the children got the chance to reunite with their birth mother in Liberia.
I didn't see her again until I was 12, and that's when my paternal family sent me and my brothers back to Liberia. My initial impression of Liberia was culture shock. They were going through a civil war at the time.
But the love that we got from my mother, first meeting her, seemed very genuine. It was something that we didn't get from my grandparents and aunt. And it only lasted for about a week, 2 weeks. After that, things changed pretty quick.
The warm reception devolved into what the kids described as being mostly ignored, as if they were an imposition. The kids saw their father Eric occasionally. Then in April 1996, the Civil War got even more dangerous.
It was scary. It was scary. At one point, we would sit out on the porch at night and see the bullets whizzing by. It was like firecrackers. And then every day worrying, is your family going to be next? Because all people talked about was the rebels.
In 1996, my mother somehow was able to get our documents that we were American citizens, and we got airlifted back here.
Over the following decade, Eric traveled back and forth between the States and Liberia and remained distant from the kids. But in the summer of 2007, things changed when he was diagnosed with cancer.
His health started declining, so he came back to the U.S. in 2007 to seek better medical treatment. Once he realized his cancer might be terminal, Eric decided to reconcile with his children.
Now, at 55 years old, Eric has been found dead in a New York apartment, and police are beginning their investigation.
There's things that you look at first. Obviously, it's important that the door was left open. You have somebody gagged and bound. Your first thought would be a robbery, a home invasion.
But why would a home invader call 911 to report the crime?
If somebody would call 911 and tell you somebody's bleeding, more often than not, that person would stay and greet the police when you got there. So given the fact that nobody was there except for Eric, you would have to think that whoever called 911 is the person that was somehow involved in this murder.
After investigators secure the crime scene where Eric Goodridge was killed, they conduct a search of the apartment. A closer look at Eric's body reveals that he was tortured.
Detectives didn't see a lot of blood. The first noticed was some small amount of blood around the groin area. Upon further inspection, they noticed that his penis was cut off. The police found a scalpel not too far from the body, and it was determined that that was the weapon used.
However, as traumatic as that must have been, it wasn't how he died.
Eric was found with a towel that was jammed down his throat and then duct taped around the rest of his face, leaving his nose exposed and his eyes. This usually indicates that the person wasn't trying to kill them because they were leaving their nose open so that they could breathe.
What we learn is that the gagging reflex little by little, just kept on grabbing that towel to the back of his throat where it cut off the airway. So even though someone looking at him might say he can breathe, his nostrils are exposed, ultimately after the struggle, the towel went to the back of his throat, which cut off that airway to his nostrils.
At first glance, detectives would believe that this was a robbery based on the fact that he was bound and gagged. But once you discovered that the penis was cut off, it would go in a different direction. It probably lead you to believe that this was more of a personal vendetta, somebody that had a personal problem with Eric. Upon further inspection of the crime scene, there was 2 notes that were discovered. One note that said, "He wrecked my life," which could be a host of different people. It could be an ex-lover, it could be his present wife, it could be an ex-wife. And the second note said, "At first, I blamed myself. Now I know it's not my fault." But once we were going in the direction of this is a domestic incident, you have to, the number one thing you would do, the first thing to do is try to identify who that 911 caller was. And then you want to see who might have a problem with Eric.
Looking for answers, dispatchers once again called the woman who originally called 911.
Hello?
Yes, hi. This is New York City Police Department. Someone called for the police?
Yeah.
The woman identifies herself as Bridget Harris.
And who is Eric? Your father? Who is Eric?
Yeah, is he alive?
Is who alive?
Eric.
I don't know. What happened to Eric?
Alright, I'll forget it.
Instead of answering the question, Bridget says she's on her way to a police station to explain what she knows.
It appeared this is something that's very personal. It was a vendetta. It was something revenge-oriented. And this was something we needed to find out from Bridget.
But Bridget never shows up at the precinct. Continuing to process the apartment, investigators establish that it belongs to Bridget. They also obtain a search warrant for Bridget's computer.
They were able to find out through this warrant that Bridget ordered a scalpel over the internet, and it was delivered to her home. The fact that somebody ordered days in advance a scalpel is the biggest indicator that it's something that was premeditated and thought out. We also found on the computer that Bridget had Googled the Lorraine Bobbitt case.
In 1993, Lorena Bobbitt famously castrated her husband, John Bobbitt, then called 911 and confessed what she'd done. John survived the attack.
Bridget went online and researched what happens if you cut off someone's penis, and that the results that they got is that the blood would coagulate and you don't die.
Bridget's computer reveals something else as well, a video confession recorded 2 days before her father died.
She went and made a video about what she was going to do, but asking everyone to not judge her until they knew everything.
While homicide detectives are scouring the city looking for Bridget Harris, she's contemplating her next move.
I sat at the library. The library is right across the street from the police station. And I just was thinking. And because the dispatcher never really said what was going on, whether he was alive or whether they had got to him in time, I was just nervous. My first thoughts are suicide.
She decides to turn to her sister for help.
For some reason, I don't know what made me do it, but I called Carlene. I told her I was on my way to the police station. And she said, "Don't go in, because I won't see you again." And I did not expect her to say that. I didn't expect her to support me at all. Carlene picked me up, took me to Staten Island, and then realized what my full plan was, and then called the ambulance for me and had me checked in.
Bridget is admitted to the psychiatric ward of the Richmond University Medical Center and placed on suicide watch. Bridget's sister contacts attorney Arthur Aidala through a mutual friend, and he agrees to meet with Bridget.
When I went to go see Bridget, she was on suicide watch. She was sitting at a table covered in a white sheet. And if she could have like just crawled into the earth, like that's what she wanted.
I was just out of it. I was started on a regimen of pills that very first night. And I had never been on any kind of mental pills either. So I had sleeping pills, anti-anxiety pills, antidepressant pills.
I do remember there was a man of the clergy who came in. He was being so sweet and he was being so nice, but I remember at one point he touched Bridget, like on her shoulder. And I remember her recoiling. And I was like, well, this poor young lady is in a lot of pain, man. I mean, a lot of pain.
Over the next 24 hours, Bridget Harris tells her story. According to her, Eric Goodridge is not the man most people think he is.
What people saw about what was happening with Eric is that he was very supportive of his children. What people didn't know is what was happening behind the scenes. Bridget said he was been molesting and raping Bridget since she's 3 years old.
My first memory of the abuse by Eric was in the guest bedroom of the house in Long Island. He took me in the room and I thought I was gonna get punished for something. I remember my stepmother wasn't home. It was just me and my 2 brothers. And he took my clothes off, got on top of me, and of course I was 3. I didn't know what was happening. I just knew he was hurting me. People say, why didn't you tell someone? When you're a child, you don't know what sex is. And that's not sex, first of all. You don't know what's happening. And the way he did it, you know, he had the belt in his hand. You're being punished for not cleaning your room.
She was so young, she could not know how to process the trauma.
You only know what you know in your family, so you don't know what the rest of the world looks like and what's expected of you as a child. So you begin to personalize it as a child. Is what am I doing for him to do these things to me?
Bridget says the abuse continued throughout her childhood, becoming more violent over time.
I remember talking about a time when she was washing the dishes and she broke a dish, and her father took a switch, a stick, and beat her on her arm until it bled.
If she told someone, they then moved to somewhere else, and it happened again.
My sister, Carlene, she never wanted to talk about it. I know we were both abused by him, but every time we brought it up, she, changed the subject or didn't want to talk about it.
Nobody believed her. The community validated him as being such a good person that they kept believing that Bridget was making up stories about him and they didn't want to see the fact that he was behind closed doors. He was a different person. He was a monster.
I feel like I could have gone to more people, to be honest, but for that to have happened, I would have had to have more support. I would have had to have more trust in people. I would have had to have seen him gotten in trouble, to see him get away with it each and every time, and nobody really doing anything. That's why I just stopped talking about it.
After Bridget and her siblings returned to the States in 1996, the well-connected Eric traveled back and forth between the 2 countries, sometimes taking Bridget with him.
He took me back in 1997 by myself, without my brothers. So I was living with him for about a year, and the abuse got out of control. Like, he just didn't care anymore. Because I knew there's no law over there. He's going to be able to do whatever he wants. I knew nobody was going to stop him.
She says she endured the abuse until she was 18 years old.
It was a very horrible one. I think that was the straw that broke the camel's back.
I didn't just lay there this time. I fought him off. And he was actually shocked. He was like, "What's wrong with you?" He thought there was something wrong with me for saying no.
They gave her the strength. She was older now, and she was 18. She was emancipated to run away.
Being that Bridget was now an adult, she returned to the U.S. Embassy where she received financial assistance to come back to the U.S. and finally escape her father's sexual abuse.
I had another little sister there. That was my only regret, is leaving her, because I knew that he was going to abuse her as well. But I was just like, I need to go.
Once in the U.S., Bridget had a very difficult time bouncing around through relatives' homes. She ended up living in a women's shelter. It wasn't until 7 years later, in 2006, where she was able to get her own apartment and finally live on her own.
I had friends. I was going out, going to concerts. I had a good job. I had my own place, everything I ever wanted. I just wanted to be alone. I was finally alone in my own apartment, and I still wasn't happy. Trying to get in a relationship with anyone was hard, and suicide was on my mind literally every day. Just constantly thought about suicide.
Then, in the summer of 2007, Bridget's abuser came back into her life.
Bridget received a call from her sister, Carlene, where she told her that her father was in town. He was actually at her house. She wanted her to come over to make amends.
When I found out he was back, I was like, okay, before I kill myself, maybe I can make sure that he's not going to hurt anyone else.
Two days have passed since 55-year-old Eric Goodrich was found dead, and investigators are still searching for his daughter, Bridget. Their next contact is from Bridget's lawyer, who explains where she is.
We found out that she went to a psychiatric ward in Staten Island. It appeared that, this is somebody that's seeking help for what she did. Normally, a detective's conditions whodunit. In this particular case, at some point you know who did it, the person confessed to it. So it's unique that now you're trying to investigate why this happened.
Bridget shares her harrowing story with police, claiming that the chain of events resulting in her father's death started when her sister asked her to come over to make amends with Eric.
The first thing that Bridget sees when she opened the door is her father bouncing her knees on his leg, just like he used to do to her, and that triggered her.
It was straight trigger, flashback. Just the fact that he's touching her, I have this issue with, and it's anyone, unfortunately. It's when I see my brothers kissing their own daughters, I get cringy. It's not something that they're doing, it's just what I remember happening to me. So to see my abuser actually touching a little girl again was, yeah.
The one thing that set Bridget over the edge was hearing her father say that he wanted to take Carlene's daughters back to Liberia. Bridget knew that if her father succeeded in taking her nieces back to Liberia, they would only be subjected to the same sexual abuse that she was subjected to.
Carlene told me he was there to make amends and, things are going to be different, and I didn't see it that way.
Carlene really felt he was going to do nothing to her children. It was Bridget who had the fear and didn't trust him.
In her mind, he was old, sickly, he's not going to do this again. But I didn't believe that. I just didn't think he was going to change.
Bridget said, I love these kids. I'm not going to allow what happened to me happen to them.
To me, the justice system wasn't going to be able to do anything. And I had already gone the route of trying to tell his family, and that didn't go anywhere.
According to Bridget, she didn't want to kill Eric, just prevent him from abusing anyone else.
That's where the research and the idea started over those next number of weeks, where she started doing research about what would happen to her father if she did this. Would he die? Would he not? And the research all showed that he shouldn't die from that injury. And then she started to take steps. and order the necessary equipment, a scalpel.
Now, she needed to get access to Eric.
I convinced him to come to my place and talk about it. I printed out some things that I was going to talk to him about. The psychological damages that kids who suffer from abuse go through, thinking we were actually going to have this talk. And then that was the backup plan. Like, if he didn't, say he was going to change or stop, then I was going to stop him.
Bridget Harris explains to police that she planned to confront her father, Eric Goodridge, to stop his sexual abuse.
I was living in Queens at the time, and Carlin was in Staten Island, so I met him at the Staten Island ferry in the city, and we took the train back to my apartment.
She wanted to talk to him about what happened and how it's important for him to be in denial that what he did to her was not okay, and it was abuse, sexual abuse. At that point, he got very angry at Bridget and started telling her, you're making stories up.
Automatically, he starts with the same lies. That's not how it happened, you're remembering it wrong. But I know what he did. There's a lot of girls out there who know what he did. There's family members out there who know what he did.
The more he was denying what happened, the more she felt she had to do something.
So I'm like, he's definitely not changing. This is worthless. That's pretty much what I screamed at him. I was like, you're a horrible person. You know what you did. You're not going to change. You're going to keep doing it. I'm going to make sure you don't.
Her intention was to take his weapon away. And to her, his penis was his weapon. It's how he assaulted her multiple times, all over the world. And her fear was that he was going to now use this weapon against her niece.
I pulled out the pepper sprayed him. At some point, I don't know how, but he got knocked out. And then I ran and got the handcuffs. And I handcuffed him. And I remember he was breathing weird, so I splashed some water on his face. And when he woke up, he saw his hands and he started screaming. And to stop him screaming, I got a towel and put it in his mouth, which was worst mistake.
It's not really a detective's job to work out a defense for Ms. Harris, but with respect to what you're going to charge her with, you have to know the why, because premeditated murder is different than something that is not premeditated, that's not murder.
She had no intention to suffocate him. She was leaving an airway open. She was trying to keep him from screaming or being heard.
So then I remembered, got the scalpel, and then cut it off. I remember the first thing I did was put it on the stove, because I just knew they were going to reattach it, and I didn't want that to happen. So I tried to burn it. And the smell actually kind of brought me back to like, oh crap, I just did this. I turned the stove off and I called 911.
Police operator 1937, what's the emergency?
Before I left, I looked over and I thought I saw him breathing, but obviously he wasn't. So I knew something was wrong, but I honestly did not want him to die. Dying for me, for him, is just too easy. That wasn't the best punishment, I guess you could say. Because he's dead and that's it, How many women did he hurt? How many girls did he hurt? He didn't pay for hurting them. And it wasn't up to me to take him out because I wasn't the only one that he hurt. So it wasn't about that. I just wanted him to stop hurting people.
Bridget's plan, after taking her father's weapon away, was that she was going to go down to the beach. She always loved the beach. And she had always planned to go down to the beach and to kill herself. Instead of killing herself, she reaches out to her sister and she starts to get help.
After getting Bridget's full story, authorities need to look into it.
At this point now, we're going to take steps to either disprove or prove what she's alleging. So the allegation is that she's been sexually abused, so we're going to take steps to see if there's any proof that this happened. So normally the first thing you want to do is find out who she told during the course of the abuse. Not like yesterday, but, did she tell her friends 5 years ago? Because you want to verify this abuse independent of what Bridget's saying.
With their father gone, Bridget's siblings decide to come forward with their own stories.
I would see the way he would grope my sisters, smack their butt. I would see things that just didn't look right, but I was too young to really have any idea of what was really going on. The first time I remember her telling me, I just moved to Rhode Island. This was in 2001, and that's when I remember her telling me. I think I could have gave her more attention, try to do something about it. Speak up to other adults. But I didn't. I feel like girls look to their brothers to protect them. I looked to her to protect me, and every time she always did. And, at the moment when she needed me, I couldn't return that favor.
However, other members of the influential family publicly refute claims of abuse.
There was a lot of people on my father's side that decided that Bridget's no longer part of the family, and if I choose to communicate with her, then I'm no longer part of the family either. It's nothing new. That's how we grew up. There was a lot of people that were around and wasn't around. Real love, fake love.
Bridget's attorney works to get ahead in the court of public opinion.
What needs to be taken into consideration is the history between her and the deceased, is the fact that she was subjected to a monster. A father who's supposed to protect his daughter at all costs preyed upon her.
Bridget spent 3 weeks in a psychiatric facility. After she was released, the police came and arrested her for the murder of Eric.
Before her 2009 trial, Bridget Harris is charged with both second-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter.
We were able to get the judge to charge manslaughter in the second degree as a reckless act, and that this towel was a reckless act.
I don't know if Bridget ever expressed remorse, but she did make clear that she knew what she did was wrong. And she did make clear that she was willing to accept punishment, just not excessive punishment.
Bridget had the opportunity to plead guilty in this case to a lesser sentence and a lesser charge, and she had turned that down. And I remember the look on her face, really thinking about it and saying, no, I have to tell my story. I'm going to take that chance.
In September 2009, Bridget Harris's trial for the death of her father, Eric Goodridge, is underway. Her attorneys hope the jury will be able to look past what happened and understand why.
Obviously, the evidence of a premeditation was here for someone who had no psychiatric history, right? She thought about this, she made a plan, she made a video, she said, this is what I'm going to do, and then she followed through on it. What this case boiled down to is, what does it all mean? What was going on in her head? How was she impacted by all the prior years of abuse and the recent events as her father came back into her life?
It wasn't if she did it. It wasn't even really so much why she did it. It was just, can we crawl into that jury box? Can we convince 12 people that justice is not putting her in jail?
My biggest thing was just getting people to hear my side, get the facts, because you're going to judge. I know you're going to judge, but just get the facts.
On September 21st, 2009, Bridget Harris takes the stand in her own defense.
So she's telling the world about the most personal, horrible things that happened to her. We summarized the abuse that started at 3, which was horrible, and went all the way until she was 18. Remember, the line I kept saying is, I wish I could stop there, folks, but I can't, because there's more.
Bridget finds the strength to testify about the most traumatic experiences anyone could imagine and what it did to her.
I didn't have the names for it, depression, anxiety, PTSD. I was definitely helpless. I felt that what was the point to living?
Yeah. I'm glad you didn't kill yourself.
Me too.
The prosecution here never really disputed the abuse. We were fortunate in that respect. They acknowledged that Bridget was credible, was being truthful about the abuse that she suffered.
What'd the prosecutor do? She did the smartest thing she could do. She basically stood there and she's saying, on this date, on this time, did you intend to cut off your father's penis? Yes. Would you consider that to be seriously physically injuring him? Yes. And you gagged him, right? Yes. And then he died? Yes. And those are all the elements of manslaughter in the first degree? Yes. So now you have this woman charged with murder, just admitted that she satisfied all of the elements at the very least of manslaughter in the first degree.
The jury deliberates for less than 3 hours.
When they said there's a verdict, my heart was pounding. And I have the verdict sheet right in front of me that the jurors have. How do you find the defendant, Bridget Harris, on the first count of murder in the second degree? Not guilty, I check it off. How do you find the defendant, Bridget Harris, in the second count of manslaughter in the first degree?
They had found her not guilty of murder in the second degree. They had found her not guilty of manslaughter in the first degree, which was also an intentional act. So this was definitely a victory.
Instead, the jury finds Bridget guilty on the lesser charge of second-degree manslaughter, the unintentional killing of someone without legal justification.
The real unique part is, I believe it was 9 jurors, 9 of the 12, came to the sentencing and sat right in the front row so that the judge could see them. They had already written letters to the judge asking for no jail. Please don't sentence her to any more jail, just let her go.
But Judge Cooperman decided to sentence her to the maximum that he was allowed to under the law, which was a minimum of 5 years and a maximum of 15. And what that meant is that Bridget would come up for parole after 5 years.
I was relieved for it to be over, happy that it wasn't as horrible as I thought it was going to be, and just hopeful for the future, thinking, okay, the secret's out. Now I can start healing. Maybe I can have a future. Maybe I can be happy. And then the jury, too, just the fact that the jury was on my side, I didn't expect people to be on my side at all. At all.
When she finally came home 5 years later, I was excited. We took the drive to Brooklyn to go and get her. It was just good to have her back.
Bridget, to this day, has been a productive, functioning member of society. And it's great to see that she's now reaching the potential that she should have been able to reach when she was a little girl.
Eventually, I want to own a restaurant, multiple restaurants, starting with the food truck. But more importantly, what I'm working on right now is writing my memoirs, getting everything down, because I do want to advocate for survivors of abuse. I want it to end. I want to break the cycle.
I think that what happened to Bridget is something that is important for us to learn from, because I think that when children say they're being hurt, we should listen.
This story is tragic and very heartbreaking, but it is more common than we think. Child sexual abuse is a global issue. We need to protect our children.
I want people to be comfortable telling my advice to anyone this is happening to. Don't wait. And I know it's hard because how people judge and what people say, but if you know what's happening to you, you have to tell someone. And not just someone, you have to keep telling as much people as you can, because they're gonna keep doing it. And that's why they keep doing it, because they know you're afraid and they know people won't believe, so they take advantage of that. So telling is the only option. I want this abuse to stop. It's just, enough is enough.
On the morning of November 24th, 1989, the roads of northern New Brunswick were covered by the dull gray colors of late autumn. Bare trees stretched across the landscape like skeletal fingers. The wind moved through the forest surrounding the Miramichi region with a cold persistence that seemed to seep into walls, vehicles, and human bones alike. For nearly 7 months, the people living in this quiet corner of Canada had been waiting for a nightmare to end. They locked their doors before sunset. They checked windows twice before going to bed. Some slept with baseball bats beside their beds. Others left lights burning throughout the night, hoping illumination might somehow keep evil away. Yet on that particular morning, the nightmare was still alive. Somewhere along those rural roads, a man was running out of places to hide. Police vehicles moved through the region. Officers studied maps. Roadblocks appeared where only weeks earlier there had been nothing but peaceful stretches of countryside. Residents listened to radio reports with growing anticipation. Rumors spread from kitchen tables to gas stations, from churches to grocery stores. Everyone was asking the same question. Could this finally be the day they caught him? The man they hunted was not merely a fugitive. He was a killer, a predator, a ghost who seemed capable of appearing anywhere and disappearing again before authorities could close their hands around him. His name was Alan Legere. Years earlier, he had already proven himself capable of terrible violence. He had already taken a life and shattered another. A court had sentenced him to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Justice, it seemed, had already been served. But justice had underestimated him. A simple trip to a hospital had become an opportunity. An opportunity had become an escape. And an escape had become a reign of terror. For months, an entire region lived under the shadow of a man who appeared to enjoy leaving devastation behind him. Elderly residents became prisoners inside their own homes. Families who had spent generations believing their communities were safe suddenly found themselves staring through curtains whenever headlights appeared in the darkness outside. Parents warned their children not to wander. Churches organized neighborhood watches. Strangers became suspects. Every unfamiliar vehicle triggered concern. Every knock at the door produced anxiety. Every barking dog in the middle of the night could send hearts racing. The fear was not imagined. It was earned, because during those months, people were dying. Not quickly, not peacefully, not by chance. The victims were often vulnerable, older, living alone, the kind of people who spent their lives building communities rather than harming anyone. People who represented warmth, stability, and kindness, the exact opposite of the man who targeted them. Investigators who walked into the crime scenes would later struggle to describe what they found. Some had spent decades in law enforcement. They had witnessed accidents, murders, and tragedies of every kind. Yet there was something about these killings that lingered, something excessive, something deeply personal. The violence seemed to continue long after death became inevitable. The victims did not simply lose their lives. They suffered, and afterward, fire often followed. Flames consumed evidence. Smoke rose into the Canadian sky. Homes became blackened ruins. Families were left with ashes where memories once lived. As the body count grew, so did the pressure on police. Every day Legere remained free was another day someone else might die. The hunt expanded. Officers worked exhausting hours. Tips flooded switchboards. Helicopters searched remote areas. Roadblocks appeared across the region. Yet somehow, Alan Legere continued slipping away. He became a living legend of fear. People spoke his name in lowered voices. Some imagined him hiding deep in the forests. Others believed he was receiving help. Theories multiplied. Facts became tangled with rumors. The longer he remained free, the larger he seemed to become. But monsters are rarely born from nowhere. They have histories, patterns, moments that reveal pieces of the darkness hiding beneath the surface. And Alan Leger was no exception. Long before the headlines, long before the manhunt, long before Canada would come and know him as the monster of the Miramichi, there were warning signs. There were choices. There were victims. One of them was an elderly man named John Glendenning. On a June evening in 1986, John and his wife Mary were living a quiet life in Black River Bridge. They were not wealthy. They were not famous. They were simply people who had spent decades building a life together, the kind of people most communities are built around. Neighbors knew them. Friends respected them. Nothing about that evening suggested it would become one of the darkest nights in New Brunswick criminal history. Outside, the summer air was calm. Inside, the Glendennings could never have imagined that three men were moving toward their property. The electricity would soon be cut. Darkness would swallow the house. And violence would arrive at their doorstep. When the attack was over, John would be dead. Mary would be left fighting for survival. The brutality shocked investigators. The crime felt savage even by homicide standards. Authorities eventually arrested Alan Leger and his accomplices. The legal system responded. Courts reviewed evidence. Witnesses testified. A conviction followed. For most people, that should have been the end of the story. But it was only the beginning. Because prisons are built on one fundamental assumption, that those inside remain inside. In May of 1989, that assumption failed. Somewhere within a hospital visit that should have been routine, Alan Leger saw an opportunity. While authorities believed they had control, he was already thinking ahead, already planning, already calculating. The details would later astonish investigators. The escape itself seemed almost impossible. Yet impossible things have a way of happening when determination meets vulnerability. When guards finally realized what had happened, Leger was gone. The clock began ticking immediately. Every minute mattered. Every hour increased the distance between hunter and hunted. Authorities launched a massive search. But searches require clues. And clues require mistakes. Leger was not making many. Instead, he disappeared. And then weeks later, the killings began. What happened next transformed an escaped prisoner into one of the most feared criminals in Canadian history. A woman named Annie Flam would lose her life. Another woman, Nina Flam, would survive a nightmare that left scars no one could see and others that would never fully heal. Months later, two sisters would be found dead inside a home that had become a scene of unimaginable violence. Then a priest, a respected member of the community, a man whose life had been devoted to faith and service. He too would become a victim. By then, fear had spread beyond individual families. It had infected an entire region. People no longer asked whether Alan Leger might strike again. They asked where, and who, and when. No one knew the answer. That uncertainty became its own form of punishment. Every resident of Miramichi lived with the same invisible companion, dread, the kind that follows you to work, the kind that waits beside your bed, the kind that makes every unusual sound in the darkness feel significant, the kind that transforms ordinary nights into sleepless ones. As the investigation intensified, another realization began to emerge. Capturing Alan Leger would require more than manpower, more than roadblocks, more than luck. It would require a new kind of evidence, a scientific tool still unfamiliar to many Canadians, a method capable of connecting a killer to his crimes in ways fingerprints sometimes could not. At the time, it represented the future. Few people understood just how important it would become. Even fewer realized that one criminal case would help introduce it to Canadian justice on a historic scale. But that chapter was still ahead. Before science could speak, people would suffer. Before a courtroom could deliver judgment, investigators would endure frustration, exhaustion, and heartbreak. Before a region could heal, it would first be forced to confront one of the darkest chapters in its history. This is not merely the story of a serial killer. It is the story of a community under siege, A story about fear spreading through small towns where people once left doors unlocked. A story about survivors forced to carry unimaginable memories. A story about detectives chasing a man who seemed to vanish into the landscape itself. And ultimately, it is a story about justice pursuing evil across forests, highways, crime scenes, and courtrooms until there was nowhere left to run. For nearly 7 months, Alan Legere turned the Miramichi region into a place where ordinary evenings became exercises in vigilance, and where every unfamiliar face inspired suspicion. The terror felt endless. The violence felt random. The future felt uncertain. But every hunt reaches a final chapter. Every fugitive makes a mistake. Every shadow eventually encounters light. And before this story is over, we will follow every step of that journey. From the first murder that revealed the darkness inside Alan Legere, to the escape that unleashed a nightmare, to the investigation that changed Canadian forensic history forever. Because behind every headline lies a deeper story. A story of victims. A story of fear. A story of resilience. And in the frozen winds of New Brunswick, that story was written in blood, fire, determination, and the relentless pursuit of justice. This is the story of Alan Legere, the monster of the Miramichi. To understand why the name Alan Legere would one day terrify an entire region of Canada, we first need to understand the world in which this story unfolded. Because horror does not emerge from a vacuum. It arrives somewhere. It enters real communities, real homes, and real lives. And in the case of the Miramichi terror, the setting itself became one of the most important characters in the story. Northern New Brunswick in the 1980s was not a place people associated with serial killers. It was a place of forests, of rivers, of long winters and short summers, of small towns connected by winding roads that stretched through endless stretches of wilderness. The Miramichi region sat in the northeastern part of the province, a landscape shaped by nature more than by urban development. Thick forests covered enormous areas of land. Rivers cut through the countryside like veins carrying life across the region. Fishing, forestry, and small local businesses formed the backbone of many communities. Families often knew each other for generations. Neighbors waved when they passed on a road. Doors were sometimes left unlocked. Children rode bicycles through quiet neighborhoods where everyone recognized their names. Life moved at a different pace. The mornings began with the smell of coffee brewing in modest kitchens. Pickup trucks rolled down country roads before sunrise. Store owners opened their doors and greeted familiar faces. Elderly residents sat on porches during warmer months, watching the world pass by. It was not a perfect place. No community ever is. But it was a place where people generally believed they were safe. That belief would eventually be shattered. The towns scattered across the Miramichi region were the kinds of places where tragedy traveled quickly. A serious accident, a house fire, or a sudden death would become known throughout the community within hours. People attended funerals. They brought meals to grieving families. They supported one another. The idea of a predator moving silently among them felt almost unimaginable. Yet beneath the peaceful surface of these communities existed another reality: isolation. Many homes sat far apart from one another. A person could stand outside at night and hear almost nothing except the wind moving through trees. In winter, snow could blanket roads and fields so completely that entire landscapes seemed frozen in time. In summer, darkness settled heavily over rural properties once the sun disappeared beyond the horizon. The same isolation that gave residents peace also created vulnerability. A person living alone in a remote house might be miles from immediate help. A scream might never be heard. A struggle might never attract attention. A light turning on in the middle of the night could go unnoticed by everyone except the person inside the home. Those realities will become tragically important later. But before fear entered Miramichi, the region possessed a strong sense of identity. People worked hard. Families stayed connected. Churches remained central gathering places. Many residents had deep roots stretching back generations. Stories passed from grandparents to grandchildren. Tradition survived. Communities endured. Visitors often describe the area as beautiful. The Miramichi River itself became a symbol of that beauty. It wound through the region with a quiet majesty, attracting fishermen from across North America. During autumn, Trees surrounding the river exploded into brilliant colors. Reds, oranges, and yellows transformed entire hillsides into living paintings. In winter, snow softened the landscape. In spring, rivers swelled with melting ice. In summer, long daylight hours brought life back outdoors. The changing seasons shaped daily existence. People adapted. They always had. What they were not prepared to adapt to was fear. Because fear changes communities. It changes routines. It changes relationships. It changes the way people see the world around them. And eventually, fear would spread through Miramichi like an invisible fog. But before we reach that chapter, we need to look closer at the man whose actions would transform the region. Alan Joseph Legere was born in 1948. Long before newspapers would label him a monster, he was simply another child growing up in New Brunswick. Like many future criminals whose stories become infamous, there was no single moment that clearly announced what he would become. No warning siren, no dramatic sign, no obvious prophecy. Instead, the darkness emerged gradually. People who knew Legere over the years often described him as volatile, aggressive, and prone to criminal behavior. Encounters with the law became part of his life. Trouble seemed to follow him. Yet criminality alone does not explain what happened later. Many people commit crimes without becoming serial killers. Many people experience difficult lives without inflicting terror on entire communities. What separated Legere was the extraordinary level of violence that accompanied his actions. Violence that appeared capable of escalating. Violence that revealed itself repeatedly. Violence that seemed less concerned with accomplishing a goal than with causing suffering. By the mid-1980s, Legere was already well known to law enforcement. Authorities understood that he was dangerous. What they could not yet know was how much more dangerous he would become. The first major chapter of this story unfolded in Black River Bridge, a small community near Miramichi. Like countless rural Canadian communities, Black River Bridge was quiet. Residents worked hard and knew their neighbors. Many homes sat among trees or beside modest roads. The pace of life remained steady, predictable, comforting. Among the people living there were John and Mary Glendenning. They represented the kind of couple often found in small communities. Older, respected, hard-working. The sort of people who spend decades building a life together through patience and persistence. People who had survived hardships and celebrated joys. People who had earned the peaceful years that come later in life. To neighbors, they appeared ordinary. But ordinary lives often become the most heartbreaking when violence interrupts them, because there is something especially tragic about seeing peace destroyed. The attack against the Glendennings in 1986 shocked the community not only because of its brutality, but because it violated assumptions people held about safety. Violence belonged somewhere else. Violence belonged in distant cities shown on television. Violence belonged in newspaper headlines involving strangers. It was not supposed to arrive at the home of an elderly couple in a quiet rural community. Yet it did. The murder of John Glendenning and the horrific assault on Mary revealed something unsettling. Danger could exist here, too. Investigators worked the case. Evidence accumulated. Suspects emerged. Eventually, Alan Legere and 2 accomplices were arrested. The legal system moved forward. Trials occurred. Sentences were handed down. For residents of the region, there was relief. The men responsible had been caught. Justice seemed to have prevailed. Life could move forward. Or so everyone believed. At the time, nobody imagined that the conviction would later become only a prelude. Nobody imagined that the most infamous chapter had not even begun. Because prisons create a sense of finality. A convicted murderer sentenced to life imprisonment appears removed from society. The threat seems contained. Communities heal because they believe the danger has been locked away. That belief existed throughout Miramichi after Legere's conviction. People returned to normal routines. Children continued attending school. Businesses continued operating. Churches continued holding services. The region slowly moved beyond the shock of the Glendenning attack. Then came May 1989. At first, there was nothing extraordinary about the day. Prisoners require medical treatment. Hospitals receive inmates under guard. Such transfers happen regularly. They are part of the correctional system. But ordinary procedures sometimes create extraordinary consequences. Legere was transported to a hospital for treatment. What followed would expose weaknesses no one fully appreciated until it was too late. Somewhere during that visit, a convicted murderer seized an opportunity. Within hours, the impossible had happened. He was gone. An inmate serving a life sentence had escaped. The news spread quickly. Police mobilized immediately. Searches began. Roads were monitored. Tips were requested. Authorities hoped the escapee would be located quickly, perhaps within hours, perhaps within days. But as those days stretched into weeks, anxiety began growing. The forest surrounding Miramichi suddenly seemed different. The back roads felt less welcoming. The isolation that residents once cherished became a source of concern. Somewhere out there, Alan Legere was free. Nobody knew exactly where. Nobody knew exactly what he planned to do. The uncertainty itself became frightening. Conversations changed. People discussed the escape at dinner tables. Neighbors exchanged information. Rumors circulated. Some claimed to have seen him. Others believed he had already left the province. Every possible theory found believers. Yet one reality remained constant. No one had captured him. The longer the manhunt continued, the more tension settled over the region. Police officers worked around the clock. Investigators chased leads. Citizens remained alert. The situation felt increasingly unusual. This was no longer simply a prison escape. It was becoming a crisis. And then the violence returned. When the first new attacks occurred, the fear that residents had tried to suppress suddenly became real. The escape killer was not merely hiding. He was hunting. The peaceful landscape of New Brunswick remained unchanged on the surface. Rivers still flowed. Trees still swayed in the wind. Stores still opened each morning. Churches still gathered congregations on Sundays. But beneath that familiar exterior, something had shifted. People were beginning to understand that they were living through a moment that would eventually become part of Canadian criminal history. A moment that would test law enforcement. A moment that would devastate families. A moment that would force an entire region to confront a level of fear it had never experienced before. The forests were the same. The roads were the same. The towns were the same. Yet everything felt different. Because somewhere beyond those trees, beyond those roads, beyond those quiet neighborhoods, a killer was still free. And the worst was yet to come. Before we examine the violence that would eventually place Alan Legere among the most feared criminals in Canadian history, we need to pause and focus on people whose lives were forever altered by his actions. True crime stories often become centered around killers. Their names dominate headlines. Their photographs appear in newspapers. Their crimes are analyzed repeatedly. Yet the real story belongs to the people who never asked to become part of it. The victims, the families, the survivors, the ordinary men and women who woke up expecting another normal day and instead found themselves caught in a nightmare. In the Miramichi terror, there was no single victim story. There were several, different lives, different backgrounds, different dreams. What united them was not who they were. It was who crossed their path. And perhaps the most heartbreaking truth is that none of them appear to have been chosen because of personal conflicts or past disputes. They were not enemies. They were not participants in a dangerous world. Most were simply vulnerable individuals living ordinary lives. People who represented the very fabric of their communities. To understand the horror that followed, we must first understand who these people were before tragedy transformed them into names in police files. The story begins with John and Mary Glendenning. When people in rural New Brunswick spoke about couples who had built a life together through hard work and perseverance, they often spoke about people like the Glendennings. They belonged to an older generation, a generation that had survived difficult economic periods, harsh Canadian winters, and the countless challenges that accompany a lifetime of responsibility. They understood sacrifice. They understood commitment. They understood what it meant to spend decades creating a home. By the mid-1980s, John and Mary were elderly. Their lives had settled into familiar routines. The frantic pace of youth had long since faded. Days moved more slowly. Responsibilities became smaller. comfort came from familiarity. Their home in Black River Bridge reflected that life. It was not a mansion. It was not luxurious. It was simply home. The place where memories accumulated year after year. The place where holidays had been celebrated. The place where family gatherings had occurred. The place where photographs marked the passage of time. People often imagine elderly couples as fragile figures disconnected from the world. In reality, many remain deeply woven into their communities. They know neighbors. They attend local events. They become living archives of local history. The Glendennings were part of that world. The kind of people who might stop to chat with neighbors. The kind of people who recognized familiar faces. The kind of people who expected kindness more often than cruelty. Their lives reflected trust. Trust in community. Trust in routine. Trust in the belief that tomorrow would look much like today. That trust would be shattered on a summer night in June of 1986. But before violence arrived, there was simply an elderly couple living quietly. The image matters because it reminds us what was stolen. Not just life. Peace. Security. Dignity. A future. When the attack occurred, it did not only end John Glendenning's life. It destroyed an entire world that he and Mary had spent decades building. For Mary, survival came with its own burden. Physical injuries eventually heal. Emotional wounds often do not. Imagine the experience from her perspective. One moment, home is the safest place in the world. The next, it becomes a setting for unimaginable violence. The walls remain standing. The furniture remains in place. Yet everything changes. Every room carries memories. Every sound triggers fear. Every shadow feels different. Survivors often describe this transformation in haunting terms. Places once associated with comfort become reminders of trauma. For Mary, the attack was not merely something that happened. It became something she carried. Something that followed her long after emergency vehicles departed and investigators completed their work. Yet the Glendenning tragedy would eventually become only the beginning. 3 years later, another woman would find herself facing horrors that few people can truly comprehend. Her name was Nina Flam. To understand Nina's story, we must first understand the life she shared with her sister Annie. The Flam sisters lived quietly. Like many older women in rural communities, they built their lives around routines, family connections, and familiar surroundings. Their home represented safety. It represented stability. It represented decades of accumulated memories. Annie Flam was known as a kind and independent woman. She belonged to the generation that valued hard work, resilience, and personal responsibility. People who knew her remembered her as someone who had spent her life navigating challenges with determination. She had experienced triumphs and hardships like everyone else. She had lived a full life. The same was true of Nina. The sisters shared more than a home. They shared history. The unique bond that exists between siblings who have known one another longer than almost anyone else on earth. Together, they carried childhood memories, family stories, experiences stretching back decades. Their relationship had survived the passage of time. In many ways, their lives reflected the quiet dignity often found among elderly residents of small communities. They did not seek attention. They did not seek recognition. They simply lived. Then one night, their lives collided with a fugitive who had already demonstrated a willingness to inflict terrible violence. The attack on the Flam sisters would become one of the most disturbing chapters in the entire case. Not only because Annie lost her life, but because Nina survived. Survival is often portrayed as a happy ending. Reality is more complicated. Survivors frequently endure memories that refuse to fade. Images, sounds, moments, questions. The mind revisits them repeatedly, attempting to understand, attempting to process, attempting to heal. When Nina survived the attack, she became one of the most important witnesses in the investigation. But before she became a witness, she was a victim, a woman forced to experience terror inside her own home, a woman whose sense of security was destroyed, a woman who would spend the rest of her life carrying memories no one should ever have to possess. The death of Annie and the suffering inflicted upon Nina affected far more than two individuals. Family members experience grief. Friends experience shock. Community members experience fear. Because crimes like these create expanding circles of impact, the violence begins with direct victims, then spreads outward. Parents, children, siblings, neighbors, entire communities. Everyone feels the consequences. As the manhunt continued, another family would soon join that expanding circle of loss. Donna and Linda Donnie were sisters. Like the Flam sisters, they shared a lifetime of memories. The relationship between sisters often contains a unique intimacy. They witness one another's successes, failures, joys, and disappointments. They grow older together. They become constants in a world that continuously changes. Donna and Linda represented another example of ordinary people living ordinary lives. The type of lives that rarely attract media attention until tragedy arrives. Their home was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place protected from the dangers of the outside world. Instead, it became a crime scene. One of the details that continues to haunt investigators is the level of violence involved in their deaths. Experienced officers who had worked numerous homicide cases reportedly found themselves disturbed by what they encountered. Violence can sometimes reveal something about the offender. The intensity of these attacks suggested rage, cruelty, a willingness to continue inflicting harm long after control had already been established. For the Donnie family, however, criminal profiling was irrelevant. What mattered was loss. 2 sisters gone. 2 lives ended. 2 futures erased. Family photographs suddenly became priceless artifacts. Birthdays became painful reminders. Holidays became incomplete. Empty chairs appeared at gatherings. Conversations changed forever. Every homicide creates these invisible consequences. The public sees headlines. Families experience absence. And then there was Father James Smith. His story illustrates another devastating aspect of the case. Father Smith was not simply an individual. He was a community figure, a spiritual leader, a man who had devoted much of his life to serving others. People turned to him during moments of celebration and sorrow. He officiated weddings, conducted funerals, provided comfort during difficult times. For many residents, he represented stability, compassion, guidance. The presence of a priest often carries symbolic meaning within a community. Priests become woven into people's lives. They are present during baptisms, marriages, illnesses, and deaths. Their role extends beyond religious duties. They become trusted figures. The attack that claimed Father Smith's life therefore carried emotional consequences beyond the loss of one individual. It felt like an attack on the community itself. If someone like Father Smith was not safe, who was? That question echoed across Miramichi. It haunted conversations. It lingered in people's minds after dark. Because by late 1989, residents were no longer viewing these crimes as isolated events. They were seeing a pattern, a terrifying pattern. Elderly victims, brutal violence, fear spreading across multiple communities. The realization changed everything. The victims themselves shared another important characteristic. None appeared equipped to defend themselves against a determined attacker. Most were older. Many lived relatively quiet lives. They represented some of the most vulnerable members of society. The people communities are supposed to protect. The people who should be able to feel safest. Instead, they became targets. Looking back today, decades later, it is easy to focus on the scale of the investigation, the prison escape, the forensic breakthroughs, and the dramatic manhunt. Yet beneath every headline were real human beings. John Glendenning was more than a murder victim. Mary Glendenning was more than a survivor. Annie Flam was more than a name in a police report. Nina Flam was more than a witness. Donna and Linda Donnie were more than statistics. Father James Smith was more than another casualty. They were people. People with routines. People with families. People with memories. People who mattered. And perhaps that is the most important thing to remember before we move deeper into this story. Because the terror that engulfed Miramichi was never merely about one dangerous fugitive. It was about what happened when violence entered the lives of ordinary people who never expected it. It was about the human cost. The The cost measured not only in lives lost, but in trust destroyed, in families broken, in communities forever changed. As the summer of 1989 unfolded and the escaped killer remained free, those costs would continue to rise. More fear, more grief, more uncertainty. And soon, the nightmare would become even more terrifying because the man responsible was still out there, watching, moving, waiting. And the next chapter of the story will reveal exactly how that nightmare unfolded. Every nightmare has a moment when fear becomes reality. For the people of Miramichi and the surrounding communities of northern New Brunswick, that moment did not arrive all at once. It unfolded gradually, spreading from one crime scene to another, from one frightened family to the next. Looking back now, it is easy to see the pattern. At the time, however, people experienced the terror in fragments. A murder here, an assault there, rumors, police warnings, newspaper headlines. Each event felt shocking on its own. Together, they formed one of the darkest criminal chapters in Canadian history. The story of the violence begins on a warm summer evening, June 21st, 1986. The longest days of the year had arrived in New Brunswick. The sun lingered late into the evening. The forest surrounding Black River Bridge glowed beneath the fading light. Rural roads stretched quietly through the countryside. Most residents were settling into familiar routines. Supper dishes had been washed. Televisions flickered inside modest homes. Elderly couples prepared for another peaceful night. Among them were John and Mary Glendenning. Nothing about the evening suggested danger. Nothing hinted that several men were already moving toward their property. The attack was planned. Before entering the home, the intruders cut electrical power to a nearby store, plunging the area into darkness. It was a deliberate act, a calculated effort to remove visibility and increase confusion. Darkness settled across the property. Inside the house, John and Mary likely experienced the same uncertainty anyone would feel when something suddenly seemed wrong. A strange noise, a disruption, a moment of confusion. Then came the intrusion. The violence that followed was savage. The attackers entered the home and confronted the elderly couple. John Glendenning became the primary target. The assault against him was so severe that investigators would later describe it as extraordinarily brutal. He suffered devastating injuries during the attack. The men were younger, stronger, overwhelmingly dominant. John never had a realistic chance. What occurred inside that house was not a simple robbery gone wrong. It was violence unleashed upon people who were incapable of defending themselves. By the time the attackers finished, John Glendenning was dead. Mary's ordeal was not over. She endured her own horrific attack. In addition to severe physical violence, she suffered further victimization that would leave emotional scars impossible to measure. Then the intruders left. The silence that followed must have felt unreal. Imagine the scene. A darkened home. An elderly woman gravely injured. Her husband lying dead. No immediate help. No certainty that the attackers were truly gone. Only pain, shock, confusion. And somehow, despite everything she had endured, Mary Glendenning survived. In one of the most remarkable acts of determination in the entire case, she managed to reach a telephone and call for help. That phone call became the difference between life and death. Emergency responders arrived. Investigators began their work. A community struggled to comprehend what had happened. For many residents, the crime felt almost impossible to understand. The victims were elderly. The violence was extreme. The cruelty seemed unnecessary. The attack violated every expectation people had about safety in their community. Eventually, authorities identified and arrested Alan Legere and his accomplices. A trial followed. Convictions were secured. The community exhaled. The threat appeared over. But history would prove otherwise. 3 years later, the situation changed dramatically. May 1989. Alan Legere was serving a life sentence. The justice system had done its job, or so everyone believed. Then came the escape. Details emerged slowly. During a hospital visit, Legere managed to free himself from restraints and flee custody. Within hours, law enforcement agencies across the region mobilized. Roads were monitored. Search teams assembled. Tips poured in. Police expected the fugitive would eventually make a mistake. Instead, he vanished. Days passed, then weeks. The search continued. The escaped murderer remained free. At first, residents felt concerned. As time passed, concern evolved into something darker. Anxiety. The kind of anxiety that follows uncertainty. Because no one knew where Alan Legere was. No one knew whether he was hiding nearby. No one knew what he planned to do next. Then, on May 28, 1989, the nightmare resumed. The target this time was a house occupied by two sisters, Annie Flam and Nina Flam. The evening began like countless others. Nothing appeared unusual. No warning signs announced the danger approaching their home. Somewhere outside, however, a fugitive killer was moving through the darkness. At some point, Legere entered the property. What happened next transformed the house into another scene of horror. Inside, the sisters suddenly found themselves confronting an armed intruder. The atmosphere must have shifted instantly. One moment normality, the next moment terror. Legere quickly established control. Nina Flam became trapped in a situation no one should ever experience. Threatened with a weapon, restrained, and subjected to prolonged violence, she was forced into a nightmare from which escape seemed impossible. Fear operates differently in moments like these. Time slows. Thoughts become fragmented. Every second stretches. Victims focus on survival, on staying alive long enough to see another sunrise. For Nina, survival meant enduring uncertainty, enduring pain, enduring the horrifying reality that she could hear violence occurring elsewhere in the home. While Nina suffered her own ordeal, Annie faced something even worse. The attack against her was extraordinarily violent. Investigators later determined that she endured a brutal assault that ultimately claimed her life. The details revealed a level of aggression that shocked even experienced officers. There are crime scenes that disturb investigators because of what happened. Then there are crime scenes that disturb investigators because of how much happened. The attack against Annie Flam belonged in the second category. When the violence ended, Legere was still not finished. He attempted to erase evidence. Fire became part of the plan. Flames began consuming portions of the residence. Smoke filled the air. The house that had once represented safety transformed into a burning crime scene. Firefighters eventually responded. Investigators arrived. Emergency personnel worked through chaos and destruction. And amid that destruction, one extraordinary fact emerged. Nina Flam was alive, injured, traumatized, forever changed. But alive, her survival will become critically important, not only because she deserved justice, but because she could help identify the man responsible. For residents across the region, however, the attack created a terrifying realization. The escaped murderer had not disappeared. He was active, and he was capable of striking again. The summer passed. The search continued. Tips arrived daily. Police followed countless leads. Many proved worthless. The fugitive remained elusive. As months passed, tension spread throughout the region. Residents modified routines. People checked locks repeatedly before bed. Outdoor lights remained on all night. Families discussed contingency plans. The fear was no longer hypothetical. It was based on evidence. People had already died. Then came October 13th, 1989. Autumn had settled over New Brunswick. Leaves covered roads and yards. The air carried the chill of approaching winter. Inside a residence in Newcastle, two sisters were spending what should have been another ordinary evening. Donna Donnie, Linda Donnie. Like so many victims before them, they had no reason to believe danger was approaching. Yet somewhere in the darkness, Alan Legere was once again searching for opportunity. At some point during the night, he entered their home. What happened afterward ranks among the most disturbing events of the entire manhunt. The attack was ferocious. Investigators later documented extensive injuries. The violence appeared relentless. The sisters suffered catastrophic trauma. Evidence suggested prolonged suffering. The crime scene itself reflected chaos, struggle, desperation, fear. Officers who entered the residence encountered a level of brutality rarely seen even in homicide investigations. Years later, Many would still remember the scene, not because it was the bloodiest, not because it was the most famous, but because the violence felt excessive, personal, almost impossible to comprehend. As before, Leger attempted to destroy evidence. Fire once again followed murder. Flames damaged the residence. Investigators faced additional challenges reconstructing events. Yet despite the destruction, one reality remained undeniable. 2 more innocent people were dead. The region reacted with increasing alarm. Many residents now believed no one was safe. The victims had varied backgrounds, different lifestyles, different locations. What connected them was vulnerability. The randomness felt terrifying. If there was a pattern, ordinary citizens could not see it. That uncertainty made fear even worse. Weeks later, the situation escalated further. November 16, 1989. Winter approached. Darkness arrived earlier each evening. By this point, Miramichi had spent months living under the shadow of an active manhunt. Then another murder occurred. This time the victim was Father James Smith. At 69 years old, Father Smith represented stability within the community. He was known, respected, trusted, the kind of person residents expected to see helping others rather than becoming the subject of a homicide investigation. Yet that night, he found himself alone inside the parish residence. At some point, Leger entered. What followed was another explosion of violence. The attack against Father Smith was extraordinarily brutal. Evidence later revealed extensive injuries. Investigators determined that he had endured a prolonged assault before dying. For many residents, this murder felt different, not because the previous victims mattered less, but because Father Smith occupied a unique position within the community. His death symbolized something larger. If even a priest could become a victim, then traditional assumptions about safety no longer existed. Fear reached levels never before experienced in the region. People stopped going out at night unless absolutely necessary. Neighborhood watch groups expanded. Firearms were cleaned and placed near beds. Dogs were brought indoors. Locks were checked repeatedly. Every unfamiliar vehicle attracted attention. Every unexpected knock produced anxiety. The entire region seemed trapped in a state of collective vigilance. Meanwhile, somewhere beyond the headlines and police briefings, Alan Leger remained free, moving, hiding, watching. The manhunt intensified. Investigators worked exhausting hours. Pressure mounted. Political leaders demanded results. Citizens demanded protection. Families demanded justice. The fugitive had now left a trail of devastation stretching across multiple communities. Several victims were dead. One survivor carried unimaginable trauma. Thousands of residents lived in fear. Law enforcement understood that stopping him was no longer simply a matter of solving crimes. It had become a race against time. Because every day Alan Leger remained free created another possibility, another target, another family, another tragedy. And as November continued, investigators would finally begin moving closer to the breakthrough they desperately needed. The nightmare was approaching its final chapter. But before justice could arrive, the hunt would become more intense than ever before. The killer was still out there, and the entire region knew it. Every murder investigation begins with questions. What happened? Who did it? Why? In most cases, investigators start with uncertainty. They arrive at a crime scene knowing almost nothing. Every object becomes important. Every footprint matters. Every witness statement may contain the detail that unlocks the truth. The Alan Leger case was different. By the time investigators stepped into the later crime scenes, they already had a name in the back of their minds. The problem was proving it. Suspicion and evidence are not the same thing. Police could suspect Alan Leger all they wanted. Courts required proof. Communities needed certainty. Families deserved answers supported by facts rather than assumptions. And gathering those facts would become one of the greatest challenges in Canadian criminal history. The first major crime scene linked to Leger's violence was the Glendenning residence in June 1986. When emergency responders arrived at the property that night, they encountered a scene of devastation. The home itself reflected the suddenness of the attack. Objects were displaced. Evidence of struggle appeared throughout portions of the residence. The atmosphere felt heavy. Violent crime scenes often carry a strange silence after emergency personnel arrive. The chaos has already occurred. The screams are gone. The confrontation is over. What remains is the aftermath. Investigators moving through the Glendenning residence faced precisely that reality. An elderly man was dead. His wife was gravely injured. Blood evidence revealed the severity of the assault. Photographs documented every room. Measurements were taken. Items were collected. Fingerprints were searched for. Detectives moved carefully, understanding that every detail might later become important. The physical evidence painted a disturbing picture. This was not an accidental confrontation. This was not a brief altercation. The injuries indicated sustained violence. The attackers had remained long enough to leave behind numerous clues. And unlike later crime scenes connected to Leger, fire had not yet complicated the investigation. Evidence survived. Investigators were able to reconstruct much of what happened. Eventually, that evidence contributed to the arrest and conviction of Alan Leger and his accomplices. For a time, the case appeared closed. The files were archived. The legal process concluded. Justice had seemingly done its work. Then came May 1989. The prison escape changed everything. What had once been a solved homicide case suddenly became a foundation for a new nightmare. When Alan Leger disappeared after escaping custody, law enforcement agencies immediately recognized a potential danger. Yet at first, there was little physical evidence to follow. No crime scene, no body, no clear destination. Only an escaped murderer somewhere in the vast landscape of New Brunswick. The forests of the province created unique challenges for investigators. Thousands of square kilometers of wilderness stretched across the region. Remote cabins dotted the landscape. Abandoned structures existed in isolated locations. Countless secondary roads branched away from major highways. A determined fugitive could disappear surprisingly effectively. Police searched. Roadblocks appeared. Aircraft assisted when possible. Officers interviewed acquaintances. Tips flooded switchboards. Many leads seemed promising. Most went nowhere. Then, on May 28, 1989, investigators received a call that transformed the manhunt. Something terrible had happened at the residence of Annie and Nina Flam. The first responders arriving at the property immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. Smoke lingered in the air. The smell of burn would mix with something far more troubling. Firefighters had already battled portions of the blaze. Water pooled across sections of the property. Charred debris covered parts of the structure. Crime scene investigators face unique difficulties when fire is involved. A homicide scene preserves clues. A fire destroys them. Fingerprints disappear. Biological evidence degrades. Objects become unrecognizable. Timelines become harder to establish. And yet, despite the destruction, important evidence survived. Investigators entered cautiously. They documented everything. Every damaged room. Every burned surface. Every indication of movement through the house. Then they discovered the victim, Annie Flam. The brutality of the attack was immediately apparent. Even experienced detectives understood they were confronting something extraordinary. The injuries suggested intense violence. The scene reflected chaos. The destruction created by the fire complicated analysis, but could not completely erase what had occurred. Then came the discovery that changed the investigation. A survivor, Nina Flam. In many homicide investigations, physical evidence carries the entire burden of telling the story. Here, investigators had something more. They had a living witness. Nina's condition reflected the severity of the ordeal she had endured. Medical personnel focused on treatment, while detectives began the difficult process of gathering information. Witness interviews conducted after traumatic events require extraordinary care. Memories can be fragmented. Fear can distort details. Shock affects perception. Yet survivors often provide critical pieces of the puzzle. Nina's account helped investigators understand the sequence of events inside the home. It provided insights into the attacker. It reinforced suspicions that many investigators already held. As details emerged, a troubling pattern became visible. The attack involved extreme violence. The victims were vulnerable. The offender demonstrated confidence and control. And then there was a fire. The apparent attempt to destroy evidence suggested planning. This was not random violence. Someone had entered that house with purpose. As investigators processed a flam crime scene, forensic teams worked tirelessly to recover every possible clue. Technicians sifted through debris. Photographers documented damage. Laboratory specialists prepared evidence for analysis. Every fragment mattered. Every fiber. Every biological sample. Every impression left behind. The challenge was enormous. Technology in 1989 was far less advanced than what modern investigators possess today. Many forensic techniques that audiences now take for granted were still developing. DNA analysis existed, but it had not yet become a routine investigative tool. Many detectives still relied heavily on traditional evidence: fingerprints, witness statements, physical objects, behavioral patterns. Investigators needed all of them. Because Alan Leger remained free. Months later, another horrifying call arrived. October 13th, 1989. The Donny residence. When first responders entered the scene, they encountered a level of violence that stunned even seasoned professionals. Crime scene photographs would later reveal extensive destruction. Furniture had been disturbed. Evidence of struggle appeared throughout portions of the home. Blood evidence indicated prolonged violence. The atmosphere inside felt almost frozen in time. Investigators often describe homicide scenes as snapshots of the final moments of a person's life. Every object tells part of the story. A chair out of place, a broken item, a door left open. At the Donny residence, those silent details spoke volumes. Donna and Linda Donny had fought for survival. The physical evidence suggested resistance, movement, desperation. The injuries documented by forensic experts revealed extraordinary brutality. Yet once again, investigators faced a familiar obstacle: fire. The offender had attempted to destroy evidence after the murders. Flames had damaged portions of the scene. Heat altered materials. Smoke contaminated surfaces. Potential clues vanished forever. Some investigators later remarked that the repeated use of fire appeared almost ritualistic, not merely practical. Predictable, a signature element that linked multiple crime scenes together. Patterns matter in serial investigations. Patterns connect events. Patterns reveal behavior. Patterns identify offenders. As detectives compared evidence from various attacks, similarities became increasingly difficult to ignore. The same overwhelming violence. The same vulnerable victims. The same post-crime destruction. The same sense of calculated cruelty. Public fear continued growing. Every new crime scene reinforced the belief that a single offender was responsible. Every day without an arrest intensified pressure on law enforcement. Then came the murder of Father James Smith. November 16, 1989. The discovery shocked the community, not only because another victim had died, but because of who the victim was. The crime scene inside the parish residence revealed another savage assault. Investigators arriving at the location already suspected what they might find. They were no longer dealing with isolated events. They were hunting a serial predator. Yet knowing that fact did not make the scene easier to process. Father Smith's injuries reflected extraordinary violence. Again, detectives documented everything. Again, forensic specialists collected evidence. Again, analysts searched for anything capable of linking the offender directly to the crime. By now, investigators had accumulated enormous amounts of information: witness reports, physical evidence, behavioral observations, geographic patterns. The challenge was transforming information into proof. Throughout the investigation, command centers operated almost continuously. Maps covered walls. Photographs accumulated. Evidence logs expanded daily. Detectives worked exhausting schedules. Some slept only a few hours at a time. Others spent weeks away from their families. The pressure was relentless. Every new victim represented a failure to stop the killer sooner. Every day Alan Leger remained free carried the possibility of another murder. Public frustration grew. Media coverage intensified. Citizens demanded answers. Yet investigators understood something the public often did not. Major cases rarely move in straight lines. Progress comes slowly, one clue at a time, one witness at a time, one laboratory result at a time. Sometimes breakthroughs emerge from details that initially seem insignificant, and hidden within the evidence collected from multiple crime scenes was something that would eventually transform the case. Something still relatively unfamiliar to many Canadians. Something capable of identifying offenders with unprecedented precision. DNA. At the time, the science remained new. Many jurors had never heard detailed explanations of genetic identification. Many lawyers remained skeptical. Many investigators were still learning its possibilities. Yet forensic scientists recognized its potential. Biological material recovered from crime scenes could tell stories impossible for witnesses to tell. It could connect people to places, places to events, events to offenders. The samples collected during the Leger investigation would eventually become some of the most important pieces of evidence in Canadian criminal history. But at this stage, investigators still face uncertainty. The evidence was being processed. Laboratories were working. Analysts were studying results. Meanwhile, the killer remained free, somewhere beyond police roadblocks, somewhere beyond search teams, somewhere beyond public view. Yet the crime scenes themselves had begun revealing a picture of a man growing increasingly confident, increasingly violent, increasingly dangerous. Each attack left traces, not enough to stop him immediately, but enough to build a case, enough to construct a path, enough to slowly tighten the net around a fugitive who believed he could continue escaping forever. The victims could no longer speak. The burned homes could no longer tell their stories. But the evidence remained, waiting, piece by piece, sample by sample, clue by clue. And before long, those clues would begin pointing investigators toward the breakthrough they desperately needed. The hunt was far from over. But for the first time, the darkness surrounding the case was beginning to crack. And through those cracks, the first real glimpse of justice was starting to appear. By the autumn of 1989, the hunt for Alan Leger had evolved into something far larger than a typical fugitive investigation. This was no longer a search for a prison escapee. It was a desperate race against a killer who seemed capable of appearing anywhere, striking without warning, and disappear before police could close in. Every new murder intensified the pressure. Every funeral deepened the grief. Every day without an arrest chipped away at public confidence. Across the Miramichi region, people wanted answers. Police wanted answers. The victims' families wanted answers. But answers proved difficult to find, because Alan Leger had become more than a suspect. He had become a shadow, a presence that everyone feared but few actually saw. The investigation expanded rapidly after the attacks connected to his escape. Task forces grew larger. Resources increased. Officers from multiple agencies coordinated efforts. Information flowed continuously between departments. Maps covered command center walls. Pins marked sightings. Lines connected locations. Timelines expanded. Every possible lead received attention. Yet despite thousands of hours of work, investigators repeatedly encountered the same problem. Nothing led directly to Alan Leger. The sheer geography of New Brunswick worked in his favor. The province's forests seemed endless. Remote cabins sat hidden among trees. Old logging roads stretched into isolated areas rarely visited by outsiders. Abandoned structures offered temporary shelter. A fugitive willing to sleep in harsh conditions could disappear for surprisingly long periods. Police searched these locations constantly. Helicopters surveyed wilderness areas whenever weather allowed. Ground teams combed through remote regions. Roadblocks appeared on highways and secondary roads. Officers stopped vehicles, checked identification, interviewed travelers. Still, Leger remained elusive. The public watched with growing frustration. Many residents struggled to understand how one man could avoid capture for so long. From a distance, the answer appeared simple. Find him, arrest him, end the nightmare. But major manhunts rarely operate that way. Investigators can only search places they know about. They can only act on information they receive. And during the Leger investigation, Information often created more confusion than clarity. Sightings flooded police lines daily. Some callers claimed they had seen him walking along rural roads. Others believed they had spotted him near rivers or forests. Some reported suspicious vehicles. Others described strangers knocking on doors. Each tip generated paperwork. Each tip required evaluation. Each tip consumed valuable time and resources. Most proved incorrect. Fear has a way of influencing perception. When an entire region expects to see a fugitive, ordinary events begin appearing suspicious. A traveler stopping for directions becomes a possible suspect. A hunter moving through the woods becomes a potential sighting. A stranger buying gasoline becomes cause for alarm. Investigators understood this. Yet they could not afford to ignore any possibility, because one of those reports might eventually be genuine. Meanwhile, the crimes themselves presented additional challenges. The offender appeared unpredictable. Traditional profiling techniques offered limited certainty. Victim selection did not reveal a simple pattern. The locations varied. The timing varied. The method shared similarities, but not enough to predict precisely where the next attack would occur. This uncertainty created enormous difficulties. Investigators often succeed by identifying patterns. Patterns create opportunities. Predictable offenders eventually expose themselves. Leger refused to cooperate with those expectations. He moved constantly, adapted frequently, and seemed willing to exploit any opportunity that presented itself. The result was an investigation filled with frustrating dead ends. One particularly difficult aspect involved determining whether he was receiving assistance. Many detectives struggled to believe that a fugitive could survive for months entirely alone. Food had to come from somewhere. Transportation had to come from somewhere. Shelter had to come from somewhere. The logical conclusion suggested support. Perhaps friends. Perhaps acquaintances. Perhaps sympathetic individuals willing to help. Investigators pursued these possibilities aggressively. Known associates were interviewed. Past acquaintances were scrutinized. Family connections were examined. Social circles were analyzed. Yet definitive proof remained elusive. Rumors circulated constantly. Some residents claimed local people were helping him. Others insisted he was surviving through theft. Still others believed he was moving between remote locations that police had not yet discovered. The truth remained hidden, and while investigators chased theories, fear continued spreading. In many communities, daily life changed dramatically. Businesses altered operating procedures. Residents installed additional locks. Neighborhood watch groups formed. People checked on elderly relatives more frequently. Parents established stricter rules for children. The fear became part of everyday life. Conversations in grocery stores often revolved around the latest developments. Coffee shops became unofficial information centers. People exchanged theories, shared rumors, compared newspaper articles. Every detail mattered because every detail might provide reassurance. Unfortunately, reassurance was becoming increasingly difficult to find. The murders had created a perception that no one was safe. Victims appeared ordinary, vulnerable, unconnected to criminal activity. That randomness terrified people. Humans find comfort in explanations. If danger follows a pattern, people can adapt. If danger appears random, everyone feels vulnerable. The Leger case seemed random, and that perception fueled panic. Within the investigation itself, detectives confronted another challenge. Evidence pointed toward Alan Leger. Yet evidence and proof are different things. The public often assumes investigators can simply arrest someone based on suspicion. Reality is far more complicated. Arrests require legal justification. Convictions require evidence. Evidence must survive courtroom scrutiny. Every conclusion must withstand challenge. Investigators therefore faced a difficult balancing act. They needed to continue searching for Leger, while simultaneously building a prosecutable case. One task focused on capture. The other focused on conviction. Both mattered equally. Capturing the wrong person would solve nothing. Convicting the right person required preparation long before trial began. This necessity forced investigators to remain methodical even while facing enormous public pressure. Every crime scene underwent exhaustive analysis. Every witness statement received review. Every laboratory result entered the growing mountain of investigative material. The workload became staggering. Some detectives later described the period as among the most demanding experiences of their careers. Long hours became routine. Weekends disappeared. Personal lives suffered. Many officers spent more time with case files than with their own families. The emotional burden proved equally difficult. Investigators are trained professionals, yet they remain human beings. Repeated exposure to violent crime affects people. Photographs linger in memory. Crime scenes remain vivid. Victims' families leave impressions. The Legere investigation involved multiple brutal murders over an extended period. Officers carried that weight daily. Then there were the survivors, particularly Nina Flam. Survivor testimony represented one of the most valuable elements of the investigation, but obtaining useful information from traumatized victims requires extraordinary care. Memory after extreme stress does not function like memory during ordinary experiences. People remember fragments. Certain details become crystal clear. Others disappear completely. Investigators worked carefully to separate uncertainty from reliability. Every description mattered. Every observation mattered. Every remembered detail became another piece of the puzzle. At the same time, behavioral analysts attempted to understand the offender. What motivated him? Why these victims? Why such extreme violence? Why the repeated use of fire? Behavioral analysis cannot identify a killer on its own, but it can reveal patterns, and patterns can guide investigations. Certain conclusions became increasingly apparent. The offender demonstrated confidence. He appeared comfortable entering occupied homes. He showed little concern for escalating violence. The attack suggested someone capable of controlling victims through intimidation and force. Most importantly, the offender appeared to derive something beyond practical benefit from the crimes. These were not efficient acts of robbery. The violence often exceeded what would have been necessary to achieve control. That observation disturbed investigators because it suggested a particularly dangerous offender, someone motivated by factors that were difficult to predict. As autumn deepened and winter approached, the investigation entered one of its most frustrating phases. Everyone suspected Alan Legere. No one could find him. The contrast became maddening. His name dominated discussions. His photograph appeared repeatedly. His crimes filled newspaper pages. Yet physically locating him remained extraordinarily difficult. Some officers privately worried that another murder was inevitable. The concern felt almost unavoidable. A fugitive willing to kill repeatedly was unlikely to stop voluntarily. Time appeared to be working against the investigation. The longer he remained free, the greater the danger became. Public pressure intensified further after the murder of Father James Smith. That crime struck a particularly emotional chord throughout the region. Priests occupied respected positions within many communities. Their role extended beyond religion. They represented guidance, stability, trust. The murder reinforced a terrifying reality. Nobody appeared beyond the reach of the killer. Following that crime, investigative efforts reached unprecedented levels. Resources were redirected. Search operations expanded. Intelligence sharing increased. Officials understood the situation had become critical. Failure carried unacceptable consequences. Every available avenue required exploration. Yet despite all these efforts, the investigation continued encountering obstacles. Tips contradicted one another. Witnesses provided conflicting information. Potential sightings placed Legere in multiple locations simultaneously. False leads multiplied. The sheer volume of information threatened to overwhelm investigators. Managing data became a challenge in itself. Teams spent countless hours organizing reports, verifying claims, and eliminating impossibilities. The process felt endless. At times, it appeared the investigation was moving in circles. Then came another complication. The media. News organizations covered the case extensively. Public interest remained enormous. Every development generated headlines. While media attention helped keep citizens informed, it also created additional challenges. Speculation increased. Rumors spread faster. Unverified information sometimes reached the public before investigators could evaluate it. Detectives occasionally found themselves responding to stories that originated from gossip rather than evidence. The noise surrounding the case grew louder. Separating fact from fiction became increasingly difficult. And yet beneath all the confusion, beneath all the frustration, beneath all the dead ends, something important was happening. The investigation was quietly accumulating evidence. Not dramatic evidence. Not the kind that immediately ends a manhunt, but evidence nonetheless. Pieces were falling into place. Crime scene analysis continued. Laboratory work continued. Witness interviews continued. The foundation of the case was growing stronger. Investigators may not have realized exactly when the breakthrough would come, but they were preparing for it. Every report, every sample, every observation, every hour of work, all of it was building toward a moment that would eventually change everything. A moment when science, persistence, and a small collection of critical clues would finally begin closing the distance between hunters and hunted. For months, Alan Legere had stayed one step ahead. For months, the investigation had seemed trapped between suspicion and proof. But that balance was beginning to shift. The dead ends were not disappearing. The frustrations remained. The fear remained. The killer remained free. Yet somewhere within the mountains of evidence collected across New Brunswick, the path toward justice was quietly emerging. And soon, investigators would finally see it. For nearly 7 months, Alan Legere had seemed almost untouchable. Police searched forests. Roadblocks appeared across New Brunswick. Investigators followed thousands of leads. Communities lived under constant fear. Yet somehow, the escaped murderer remained free. Each passing week strengthened a dangerous illusion. The illusion that he might never be caught. The illusion that he could continue moving through the shadows indefinitely. But beneath the frustration, beneath the failed leads and sleepless nights, something important was changing. The investigation was evolving. And the breakthrough that would ultimately bring down Alan Legere would not arrive through luck alone. It would emerge from persistence, from science, from countless hours of work performed by investigators who refused to stop. As the autumn of 1989 progressed, law enforcement agencies found themselves facing two urgent objectives. The first was obvious: capture the fugitive before he killed again. The second was equally important: build a case strong enough to survive in court, because investigators understood something crucial. Eventually, Alan Legere would be caught. The question was whether prosecutors would possess the evidence necessary to ensure he never walked free again. That realization influenced every decision. Every crime scene received meticulous attention. Every witness statement was preserved. Every physical sample was treated as potentially significant. At the center of this effort stood a developing forensic science that many Canadians were only beginning to understand: DNA analysis. Today, DNA evidence feels almost routine. Modern audiences expect investigators to collect genetic samples and identify suspects quickly. In 1989, the situation looked very different. The science was still relatively new. Its courtroom value remained largely untested in many jurisdictions. Some legal professionals viewed it with skepticism. Others viewed it with cautious optimism. Few people realized that the Alan Legere investigation would soon become one of the most significant tests of forensic DNA evidence in Canadian history. The biological evidence recovered from multiple crime scenes became increasingly important as investigators searched for definitive proof. Traditional evidence had limitations. Witnesses can make mistakes. Memories fade. Fingerprints are not always available. Fire destroys valuable clues. But DNA offered something different. It offered the possibility of connecting an individual directly to a crime scene through biology itself, a silent witness incapable of forgetting. In laboratories, forensic scientists worked carefully with samples recovered from various locations connected to the murders. The process required patience. Technology moved slower than modern standards. Analysis took time. Results demanded verification. Every step required precision because the stakes could not have been higher. Meanwhile, outside the laboratory, investigators continued chasing Alan Legere. And then the case suddenly accelerated. By November 1989, pressure had reached extraordinary levels. The murders of Annie Flam, Donna Donnie, Linda Donnie, and Father James Smith had created a sense of urgency unlike anything many officers had experienced. Public fear remained intense. Communities were exhausted. Residents wanted reassurance. Instead, they continued receiving warnings. Lock your doors. Stay alert. Report suspicious activity. The message remained the same because the threat remained active. Then came the final days of the manhunt. As often happens in major fugitive cases, the ending arrived quickly after months of frustration. Investigators had spent countless hours searching for a breakthrough. When it finally appeared, events began moving with remarkable speed. On November 24th, 1989, Alan Legere's ability to remain hidden started collapsing. The details that emerged painted a picture of a fugitive under increasing pressure. Months of survival on the run had taken a toll. Resources became harder to secure. Movement became riskier. The police presence throughout the region had intensified dramatically. Roadblocks appeared frequently. Officers remained highly alert. Citizens were watching more closely than ever before. The net was tightening. At some point during that critical period, Legere became involved in a desperate series of events involving stolen vehicles and hostages. Desperation often changes criminal behavior. Careful planning gives way to urgent decisions. Mistakes become more likely. Risks increase. The qualities that help fugitives survive eventually become overwhelmed by exhaustion and pressure. Investigators would later recognize that this phase reflected exactly that phenomenon. The fugitive who had spent months avoiding capture was beginning to run out of options. Reports started reaching law enforcement. Sightings, vehicle information, movements that appeared suspicious. Unlike many previous leads, these reports began fitting together. The pieces aligned. For the first time in months, investigators sensed they might be close. Very close. Police mobilized rapidly. Officers moved into position. Communication intensified. Every available detail was shared. Roads became potential interception points. Units coordinated movements. The operation transformed into a race. The objective was simple: locate Alan Legere before he disappeared again. Somewhere near Nelson, New Brunswick, that race reached its climax. The landscape surrounding the area reflected the late autumn season. Trees stood bare against gray skies. The air carried the cold edge of approaching winter. Roads stretched through rural terrain that had become familiar to officers involved in the manhunt. Months of searching had transformed much of the region into a mental map shared by investigators. Now those roads would finally lead them to the man they had been hunting. As law enforcement closed in, tension mounted. The danger remained real. This was not a suspect expected to surrender peacefully. This was a convicted murderer, an escaped prisoner, a man believed responsible for multiple killings. Officers understood exactly who they were confronting. Every decision carried risk. Every movement required caution. At some stage during the pursuit, Legere reportedly held a hostage. The situation became even more dangerous. Hostage incidents create unique pressures. Police must balance urgency with restraint. Move too aggressively, and innocent people may suffer. Move too cautiously, and opportunities disappear. The challenge becomes finding the precise moment to act. Officers involved in the operation knew they were approaching such a moment. Then, after months of fear, months of searching, months of uncertainty, the manhunt ended. Alan Legere was captured. The arrest represented far more than the conclusion of a fugitive search. It represented relief. Relief for investigators. Relief for families. Relief for entire communities. The monster, the Miramichi, was finally in custody. News spread rapidly. Residents who had spent months living with fear reacted with cautious optimism. People discussed the arrest in homes, workplaces, and community centers. For the first time in a long time, many felt they could breathe, yet experienced investigators understood something important. Capture was only the first victory. The courtroom battle still lay ahead, and that battle would depend heavily upon evidence, specifically DNA evidence. As prosecutors prepared their case, forensic science moved toward center stage. The biological samples collected from crime scenes became increasingly significant. Laboratory results helped establish connections investigators had long suspected, connections that transformed suspicion into proof, connections that placed Alan Legere where he claimed not to have been, connections that strengthened the prosecution's position enormously. The importance of this development cannot be overstated. For decades, criminal investigations relied heavily upon eyewitness testimony and traditional forensic methods. DNA offered something revolutionary, a means of identifying individuals with extraordinary precision, a means of linking offenders directly to crimes, a means of overcoming some of the limitations that had historically complicated prosecutions. The Legere case would soon demonstrate those possibilities to the entire country. Within investigative circles, excitement mixed with caution. Scientists believed in their findings. Prosecutors believed in the evidence. Yet everyone understood that a courtroom represented a different environment. Evidence must not merely exist. It must persuade. Jurors would need to understand complex scientific concepts. Judges would need confidence in the methodology. Defense attorneys would challenge every aspect. Nothing could be taken for granted. Still, the breakthrough had arrived, not only through the arrest itself, but through the convergence of traditional police work and emerging forensic science. For months, investigators had followed leads through forests, highways, and communities. For months, forensic specialists had processed samples in laboratories. Now those efforts were merging into a single case, a case capable of telling a complete story, a story built from witness testimony, physical evidence, crime scene reconstruction, behavioral patterns, and DNA. The result was powerful. The evidence no longer pointed vaguely toward Alan Legere. It pointed directly at him. The breakthrough transformed the emotional atmosphere surrounding the investigation. Before, uncertainty dominated. Now confidence began replacing uncertainty. Investigators still worked tirelessly. Prosecutors still prepared carefully. But there was a growing sense that the case had turned a corner. The momentum had shifted. For months, Alan Legere had controlled events. His actions dictated police responses. His movements generated headlines. His violence created fear. That period was ending. Now the investigation controlled the narrative. Now the evidence controlled the narrative. Now the justice system prepared to take over. The families of victims watched these developments closely. No arrest could restore lost lives. No prosecution could erase trauma. Yet accountability matters. Justice matters. Truth matters. The emerging evidence offered hope that all three might finally be achieved. As 1989 drew towards conclusion, the people of Miramichi found themselves standing at a historic moment. The fugitive was captured. The investigation had produced powerful forensic evidence. The murders that had terrorized the region appeared solved. But one final battle remained. A battle fought not in forests or on highways, not through roadblocks or manhunts. A battle fought inside a courtroom, where lawyers would argue, experts would testify, science would be challenged, and the future of one of Canada's most notorious killers would ultimately be decided. The hunt was over. The reckoning was about to begin. The courtroom was quieter than many people expected. After months of headlines, fear, manhunts, and public outrage, some imagined the trial of Alan Legere would feel dramatic from the very beginning. They expected explosive confrontations, emotional outbursts, shocking confessions. Instead, what awaited everyone inside the courtroom was something far more powerful. Evidence. Because the pursuit of justice rarely unfolds like a movie. Real justice is slower, methodical, patient, built one fact at a time. And when the trial of Alan Legere finally began in 1991, the entire country was watching. For the families of the victims, the proceedings represented something deeply personal. For prosecutors, it was the culmination of years of work. For investigators, it was the final stage of a case that had consumed countless hours of their lives. For forensic scientists, it was a historic moment. And for Alan Legere himself, it was the moment when running was no longer possible. The man who had terrorized the Miramichi region sat before the court no longer as a fugitive, but as a defendant. The contrast was striking. For months, he had controlled the pace of events. He chose where to go. He chose when to strike. He forced communities into fear and police into pursuit. Now everything had changed. Now others controlled the timetable. Others controlled the questions. Others controlled the future. Outside the courthouse, media attention remained intense. Reporters gathered daily. Television crews waited for updates. Newspaper headlines followed every development. The case had grown beyond a regional tragedy. It had become a national story. Canadians from coast to coast recognized the name Alan Legere. Many had followed the murders from the beginning. Many remembered the prison escape. Many remembered the fear that gripped New Brunswick. Now they wanted answers. The trial promised to provide them. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors faced an enormous responsibility. The allegations were severe. Multiple murders, violent assaults, a lengthy campaign of terror that had left families devastated and entire communities traumatized. Yet no matter how strongly investigators believed in Legere's guilt, belief alone could never secure a conviction. The prosecution needed proof, and they intended to provide it. The opening stages of the trial focused on establishing the chronology of events. Jurors heard about the escape. They heard about the murders. They heard about the extensive investigation that followed. Witnesses began taking the stand. Each testimony added another piece to the puzzle. Police officers described a manhunt. Investigators explained how evidence had been collected. Forensic specialists outlined their findings. The picture that emerged was both disturbing and compelling. One witness after another helped reconstruct the months of fear that had engulfed Miramichi. The prosecution's case did not depend upon a single dramatic revelation. Instead, it relied upon accumulation, individual facts, individual observations, individual pieces of evidence, each one supporting the next, each one strengthening the overall narrative. The strategy reflected a fundamental truth of criminal trials. Jurors are rarely persuaded by one piece of evidence alone. They are persuaded by consistency, by patterns, by multiple independent facts pointing toward the same conclusion. As the days passed, that consistency became increasingly difficult to ignore. The stories told by witnesses aligned with physical evidence. The physical evidence aligned with forensic findings. The forensic findings aligned with investigative conclusions. Gradually, the case grew stronger, yet the most important chapter of the trial was still ahead, because hidden within the evidence was something capable of changing Canadian criminal justice forever. DNA. Today, the term feels familiar. Most people understand at least the basic concept. In the early 1990s, however, DNA evidence remained relatively new to the public. Many jurors had never encountered it before. Many Canadians had only a vague understanding of how it worked. Even within legal circles, the technology remained a subject of intense discussion. The Legere trial will become one of the first major opportunities for Canadian courts to evaluate the power of genetic identification. When forensic experts entered the courtroom, the atmosphere changed. Their testimony represented more than science. It represented the future. The expert explained how biological samples recovered from crime scenes could be analyzed. They described the process in careful detail, how genetic markers were examined, how comparisons were performed, how probabilities were calculated. The science was complex, yet the implications were simple. Human beings carry unique genetic signatures. Those signatures can connect individuals to specific locations, specific events, specific crimes. For prosecutors, the evidence was revolutionary. For the defense, it represented a significant challenge. The defense team worked to question the reliability of the new technology. That was their responsibility. Every criminal defendant is entitled to a vigorous defense. Every piece of evidence deserves scrutiny. The courtroom became a battleground not only over Alan Legere's guilt, but over the credibility of a scientific method that was still earning public trust. Experts were questioned extensively. Methodologies were examined. Procedures were challenged. The legal arguments often became highly technical. Yet beneath the complexity stood a simple question. Could the jury trust the science? The prosecution believed the answer was yes. The forensic evidence linked Alan Legere directly to the crimes, not indirectly, not through rumor, not through speculation. Directly, the significance of that connection cannot be overstated. For months after the murders, fear and uncertainty had dominated public discussion. People suspected Legere. Investigators suspected Legere. Communities feared Legere. Now the prosecution presented evidence designed to eliminate uncertainty altogether. The victims' families listened as testimony unfolded. For them, every day inside the courtroom carried emotional weight. Photographs were shown. Crime scenes were described. Painful memories resurfaced. Trials often require families to relive the worst moments of their lives. This case was no exception. Parents remembered children. Siblings remembered brothers and sisters. Friends remembered people who would never return. The legal process demanded patience. But patience did not reduce grief. For survivors such as Nina Flam, the proceedings carried additional significance. She had endured what few people could imagine. Now she watched the justice system determine the fate of the man responsible. Survivors often describe criminal trials as complicated experiences. Part relief, part anxiety, part hope. The outcome matters enormously, yet the process itself can reopen old wounds. Every testimony forces memories back into the present. Every photograph becomes a reminder. Every legal argument concerns events that changed lives forever. As the trial continued, prosecutors systematically presented their case. Investigators described evidence recovery. Experts discussed laboratory analysis. Witnesses recounted observations. The cumulative effect proved powerful. Bit by bit, the prosecution assembled a detailed account of what had happened during those terrifying months. The defense challenged where possible, questioned assumptions, examined procedures, raised doubts. Yet the evidence remained substantial, and the DNA evidence continued occupying a central role. Many legal observers recognized that the trial carried implications extending beyond Alan Legere himself. A successful prosecution would help establish DNA as a transformative forensic tool within Canada. Future investigations could be influenced by the precedent created here. Future prosecutions could rely upon the principles being tested now. In that sense, the courtroom contained two parallel stories. One concerned a serial murderer. The other concerned the evolution of criminal justice. Eventually, after weeks of testimony and argument, the case moved towards conclusion. Closing statements offered each side an opportunity to summarize its position. Prosecutors emphasized the evidence, the patterns, the forensic findings, the overwhelming consistency of the case against Alan Legere. The defense highlighted uncertainties and urged caution. Jurors listened carefully. Their responsibility was enormous. They alone would determine the verdict. Outside the courtroom, communities waited. Families waited. Investigators waited. The country waited. Years of work had led to this moment. Then the deliberations ended. The jury returned. The atmosphere inside the courtroom grew tense. Everyone understood the significance of what was about to happen. Victims' families sat quietly. Reporters prepared notebooks. Lawyers focused on the judge. All eyes turned toward the jury. The verdicts were read. Guilty. Again and again. Guilty. The words carried enormous weight. For investigators, they represented validation of years of effort. For prosecutors, they represented success. For forensic scientists, they represented a historic achievement. For the victims' families, they represented accountability, not healing, not closure in the simplistic way people often describe it, but accountability. The recognition that the person responsible had been identified and judged. Alan Legere was convicted of the murders linked to his reign of terror. The sentencing that followed ensured he would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. No possibility remained that he would again walk freely through communities he had terrorized. The decision brought relief across New Brunswick. People who had spent months living in fear finally knew the nightmare was over. The monster of Miramichi would never return. Yet even as the courtroom emptied and the headlines celebrated the verdicts, many understood that some consequences would never disappear. The victims remain gone. Families remain changed. Communities still carried memories of fear. Justice had prevailed, but justice could not erase history. It could only acknowledge it. And as the legal proceedings came to an end, the people of Miramichi began confronting a different challenge, learning how to live after terror, learning how to rebuild trust, learning how to remember the victims without allowing the killer to define their story. That journey will become the final chapter of the Alan Legere case. When people remember true crime cases, they often remember the violence. They remember the murders, the investigations, the courtroom battles, the shocking headlines. But time has a way of changing perspective. Years pass, decades pass, and eventually, the question becomes larger than the crime itself. What was left behind? What happened to the people who survived? What lessons remained after the television cameras disappeared and the newspapers stopped printing daily updates? The story of Alan Legere does not truly end with a guilty verdict. In many ways, that was only the conclusion of the criminal investigation. The human story continued long afterward, because long after a killer is in prison, communities still carry memories. Families still carry grief. Survivors still carry scars. And history continues asking difficult questions. The Miramichi region entered the 1990s carrying emotional wounds that could not be measured in court documents. The arrest had brought relief. The convictions had brought accountability. Yet neither could restore what had been lost. John Glenn Denning never returned home. Annie Flam never returned home. Donna Dawney never returned home. Linda Dawney never returned home. Father James Smith never returned to his parish. Their futures ended the moment violence entered their lives. The guilty verdict could acknowledge that loss. It could not reverse it. For family members, grief unfolded differently than it did for the public. The public followed the case through headlines. Families lived with absence. An empty chair during holiday dinners. A birthday that arrived every year carrying painful memories. Photographs that suddenly became priceless. Voicemails that could never be replaced. Ordinary objects transformed into emotional treasures because they belonged to someone who was gone. These are realities that rarely appear in newspaper coverage, yet they represent the true cost of violent crime. The aftermath continues long after legal proceedings conclude. Survivors face their own challenges. Perhaps no one embodied this reality more clearly than Nina Flam. Survival is often portrayed as a victory, and in many ways it is. But survival also carries burdens, memories, trauma, questions, nightmares, moments that return unexpectedly years later. The human brain remembers fear, especially extreme fear. For survivors of violent crime, recovery is rarely a straight line. Some days feel normal, others do not. Healing becomes a journey measured not in weeks or months, but often in years. The courage required to continue living after such experiences is extraordinary. Yet survivors perform that courage every day, not through dramatic acts, but through ordinary ones. Getting out of bed, leaving the house, trusting people again, continuing forward. Those victories rarely make headlines, but they matter. Across Miramichi, the broader community faced another challenge, learning how to reclaim a sense of safety. Fear changes behavior. For months, residents had locked doors more carefully, checked windows repeatedly, watched unfamiliar vehicles with suspicion, listened closely to every unexpected sound after dark. Those habits do not disappear overnight. Communities remember, even after danger ends. Many residents would later describe how the manhunt changed their perception of security. Before Alan Legere's escape, many people viewed violent crime as something distant, something that happened elsewhere. The events of 1989 shattered that assumption. Residents learned that terrible things could happen even in quiet places, even in small communities, even to good people. That lesson was painful, yet it was real. In the years that followed, another aspect of the case gained increasing attention, the role of forensic science. While the murders themselves horrified the country, the investigation helped demonstrate the extraordinary potential of DNA evidence. Today, DNA analysis is one of the most powerful tools available to criminal investigators. Its use feels routine, But someone had to prove its value first. Cases like Alan Leger's helped accomplish that. The trial became a landmark moment in Canadian forensic history. Students studying criminal justice would later examine the case. Investigators would reference it. Law schools would discuss it. Scientific advances often enter public awareness through major events. The Leger trial became one of those events. The case showed that biological evidence could speak with remarkable clarity. That science could strengthen justice. That technology could help victims receive answers. In this sense, something important emerged from tragedy. Not redemption. Nothing can redeem murder, but progress. Lessons that improve future investigations. Lessons that help future victims. Lessons that strengthen the criminal justice system. The case also forced difficult conversations about prison security. One uncomfortable truth remained impossible to ignore. Several murders occurred because Alan Leger escaped custody. Had he remained incarcerated, the later victims would likely still be alive. That reality prompted serious examination of correctional procedures. Questions were asked. Policies were reviewed. Mistakes were analyzed. The public demanded accountability. Governments and institutions understood they needed answers. Major tragedies often expose weaknesses that previously went unnoticed. The prison escape represented one such weakness. Learning from failure became essential. The consequences of not learning were simply too great. Then there was a question that appears in nearly every true crime story. Why? Why did Alan Leger commit these acts? Why such violence? Why such cruelty? Why target vulnerable people? The truth is that some questions never receive satisfying answers. Criminal psychologists can analyze behavior. Investigators can examine patterns. Experts can offer theories. Yet the deepest motivations often remain hidden inside the offender's mind. Human beings naturally seek explanations. We want violence to make sense. We want a reason proportional to the suffering. Unfortunately, reality rarely provides that comfort. Sometimes the explanation is simply that a dangerous person chose to inflict pain, a person willing to cross moral boundaries most people would never approach, a person capable of treating human lives as obstacles rather than precious things. The inability to fully explain such behavior can feel frustrating. Yet perhaps focusing exclusively on the killer misses the most important lesson, because the story of Alan Leger is not ultimately a story about Alan Leger. It is a story about consequences. The consequences of violence, the consequences of trauma, the consequences of fear, and the consequences of resilience. Because alongside every tragedy in this case, there were examples of courage. Mary Glendenning surviving long enough to reach a telephone despite devastating injuries. Nina Flam enduring unimaginable terror and continuing forward afterward. Investigators refusing to abandon the hunt despite months of frustration. Forensic scientists embracing new technology to pursue justice. Communities supporting one another through fear. Families honoring loved ones despite overwhelming grief. These acts rarely receive the same attention as violence. Yet they deserve it, because they represent the opposite of what the killer stood for. Violence seeks destruction. Courage resists it. Fear seeks isolation. Community resists it. Cruelty seeks suffering. Compassion resists it. And throughout the Miramichi terror, those forms of resistance appeared again and again. Today, decades later, the forests of New Brunswick still stand. The rivers still flow. The communities still exist. Children who were not yet born during the manhunt now walk the same streets. Many residents know the story only through history. Yet the memories remain. Not because people wish to celebrate the killer, but because remembering matters. Remembering honors victims. Remembering preserves lessons. Remembering helps ensure that tragedies are neither ignored nor repeated. When historians look back on the Alan Leger case, they often focus on three things: the brutality of the crimes, the unprecedented fear that gripped an entire region, and the groundbreaking role of DNA evidence. All three deserve attention. Yet, perhaps the most important legacy is simpler. Human lives matter. Every victim mattered. Every survivor mattered. Every family mattered. The names at the center of this case were never merely entries in police files. They were people with histories, relationships, dreams, and futures. Remembering that truth is essential, because true crime should never become entertainment detached from humanity. The purpose of telling these stories is not to glorify killers. It is to understand consequences, to honor victims, to learn from the past, and to recognize the extraordinary strength that ordinary people often display during extraordinary circumstances. In the end, Alan Legere became one of Canada's most notorious criminals. His name entered history. His crimes entered history. But history does not belong to him alone. It also belongs to John Glendenning, to Mary Glendenning, to Annie Flam, to Nina Flam, to Donna Donnie, to Linda Donnie, to Father James Smith, and to the people of Miramichi, who endured months of fear, yet refused to let that fear define them forever. The headlines eventually faded. The trials eventually ended. The manhunt eventually became history. But the lessons remain. And perhaps that is where the story truly ends. Not with the killer, not with the courtroom, not with the prison cell, but with the enduring reminder that even in the darkest chapters of human behavior, courage, perseverance, and the pursuit of justice can still prevail. Years after the verdict, a strange silence settled over the story. Not the silence of forgetting, the silence of distance, the kind that arrives when enough time has passed for people to stop talking about a case every day, yet not enough time for its memory to disappear. In Miramichi, the seasons continued their endless cycle. Winter snow covered roads that had once carried police cruisers racing toward crime scenes. Spring rains washed over forests that had hidden an escaped killer. Summer sunlight returned to neighborhoods that had spent months living behind locked doors and drawn curtains. Life moved forward because life always moves forward, but memory remained. For those who had lived through 1989, there were moments when the past suddenly resurfaced. A newspaper anniversary, a documentary, a conversation between old friends, a familiar street passed during an afternoon drive, and suddenly they were back there again. Back in a time when every knock at the door carried uncertainty. Back in a time when every unfamiliar vehicle drew suspicious glances. Back in a time when fear felt as permanent as the forest surrounding their communities. The younger generation learned about the events differently. Many knew the story only through relatives. Parents told children where they had been during the manhunt. Grandparents described roadblocks and police helicopters. Teachers occasionally referenced the case when discussing local history. To them, Alan Legere belonged to another era, a frightening chapter from before they were born. Yet even for those who never experienced the terror firsthand, the story retained power, because some crimes become larger than the individuals involved. They become warnings, lessons, historical landmarks. The Miramichi terror became one of those stories. Meanwhile, inside the prison system, Alan Legere disappeared into the routine reality of incarceration. The headlines faded. The television cameras left. The public fascination diminished. What remained was a man sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars. There's a misconception that notorious criminals continue living dramatic lives after conviction. Most do not. The excitement exists in the public imagination. The reality is repetition. Days become weeks. Weeks become months. Months become years. Prison walls replace forests. Schedules replace freedom. Routine replaces movement. For Alan Legere, the long years that followed represented something he had denied his victims. Time. John Glendenning never received additional years. Annie Flam never received additional years. Donna and Linda Donnie never received additional years. Father James Smith never received additional years. Their stories ended abruptly. His continued. Many families of violent crime victims struggle with that reality. The offender remains alive while their loved ones do not. It is one of the cruelest consequences of murder. Yet the justice system is not built upon revenge. It is built upon accountability. And accountability had finally arrived. As the years passed, criminal justice experts increasingly examined the case from an academic perspective. Investigators studied the manhunt. Corrections officials studied the escape. Forensic specialists studied the DNA evidence. The case became a learning tool. Police academies discussed it. Universities discussed it. Legal professionals discussed it. Each group found different lessons hidden within the same tragedy. For law enforcement, the investigation demonstrated the importance of persistence. The manhunt had lasted months. Leads failed repeatedly. Searches produced disappointment. Yet investigators continued working. Without that persistence, the outcome might have been very different. For corrections officials, the escape highlighted vulnerabilities that demanded attention. Systems exist for a reason. Security procedures exist for a reason. Every rule written in a corrections manual was often born from a previous failure. The escape of Alan Leger reinforced that reality. For forensic science, however, the case represented something even larger, a turning point. One of those rare moments when a technological advance transforms an entire profession. Today, DNA evidence helps solve crimes around the world. Cold cases decades old are reopened. Wrongful convictions are overturned. Violent offenders are identified with remarkable accuracy. Many people now accept these capabilities as normal. But during the early 1990s, the science still required public trust. Cases like this one helped build that trust. They demonstrated what forensic genetics could accomplish. They showed juries that science could reveal truths hidden from witnesses and investigators alike. In that sense, one small piece of the legacy left behind by the case was progress. Progress built from tragedy. Progress earned at a terrible cost. Another lesson emerged from the victims themselves. Modern true crime often risks focusing too heavily on offenders. The killer becomes famous. The victims become secondary. The imbalance can feel deeply unfair, because the victims never chose their role in the story. The offender did. Years after the trial, many people within Miramichi consciously resisted allowing Alan Leger to define the narrative. Instead, they remembered the victims. They remembered neighbors, friends, family members, community leaders, people whose lives mattered long before they became associated with a notorious crime. That choice carries significance, because memory is a form of justice. Every time a victim's name is remembered, the story becomes less about the killer and more about the people he harmed. Perhaps that is why certain names continue appearing whenever the case is discussed. John and Mary Glendenning, Annie and Nina Flam, Donna and Linda Dawney, Father James Smith. Their names anchor the story to its human reality. Without them, the case becomes an abstract discussion of crime. With them, it remains what it truly was, a human tragedy. The psychological impact upon the community also deserves attention. Fear leaves marks that are not always visible. Residents who lived through the manhunt often describe subtle changes in behavior. Many became more cautious, more aware of personal security, more conscious of vulnerability. These changes were understandable. When a community experiences prolonged fear, the effects linger. Trust takes time to rebuild. Confidence takes time to rebuild. A sense of normality takes time to rebuild. Yet rebuild it did. That may be one of the most remarkable aspects of the story. Not the violence, not the investigation, not even the historic trial. The resilience, the ability of ordinary people to continue, to recover, to reclaim their lives. Human beings possess an extraordinary capacity for adaptation. Communities do too. Miramichi eventually returned to being known for rivers, forests, fishing, families, and local traditions. The murders remain part of its history. They did not become its identity. That distinction matters, because criminals often seek control. They seek power. They seek the ability to shape other people's lives through fear. The greatest defeat a criminal can experience is not merely imprisonment. It is failing to permanently define the people they try to terrorize. And in that respect, Alan Leger ultimately failed. The communities survived. The families endured. The memories remained. But life continued. Today, when people study the case, they often ask what made it so significant. Was it the brutality? The escape? The manhunt? The groundbreaking DNA evidence? The answer is all those things. Yet beneath every headline lies a simpler truth. The case mattered because it revealed both the worst and best aspects of human behavior. The worst appeared in the crimes themselves. Cruelty, violence, predation. The best appeared in the response. Courage, determination, compassion, justice, police officers who refused to quit, scientists who pursued answers, survivors who continued living despite unimaginable trauma, families who honored loved ones despite devastating loss, communities that stood together when fear threatened to divide them. Those people formed the true ending of this story. Not the killer, not the prison, not the verdict. Them, because true crime is ultimately about choices. The choice to harm, the choice to help, the choice to surrender to fear, or the choice to resist it. In 1989, an escaped murderer forced an entire region into one of the darkest periods in its history. For months, it seemed as though fear had become unavoidable. Yet fear did not have the final word. Justice did, memory did, resilience did, and decades later, when the story of Alan Leger is told, that is what remains after everything else has faded, not merely the record of terrible crimes, but the enduring proof that even after profound darkness, communities can heal, survivors can endure, and the pursuit of justice can prevail. There is one final truth about cases like Alan Leger's that often goes unnoticed. The official timeline ends. The legal files close. The appeals are exhausted. The prison sentence is imposed. And yet the story never truly disappears. It settles into the collective memory of a nation. It becomes part of the cautionary tales communities tell future generations. It becomes one of those moments people remember when discussing where they were, what they felt, and how their lives changed. For Canada, the Alan Leger case became exactly that kind of moment, not simply because of the murders, not simply because of the escape, but because it forced an entire country confront uncomfortable realities about violence, vulnerability, and the fragile illusion of safety. For many Canadians living outside New Brunswick, the Miramichi terror felt distant at first. The region seemed far away. The victims were strangers. The crimes appeared isolated. But as the months passed and media coverage intensified, those assumptions began to disappear. People realized something unsettling. The victims could have been anyone, an elderly couple living quietly after decades of marriage, two sisters sharing a home, a respected priest known throughout his community. These were not people involved in dangerous lifestyles. They were ordinary citizens. The randomness of that fact disturbed the public more than almost anything else. Human beings often search for explanations that create emotional distance from tragedy. We tell ourselves that bad things happen for identifiable reasons, that danger follows predictable rules, that victims somehow stand apart from us. Cases like this destroy those comforting assumptions. The victims of Alan Leger were ordinary people living ordinary lives. That reality forced Canadians to recognize how quickly safety can be shattered. Yet the case also revealed something else: how communities respond when that safety disappears. During the months of fear, neighbors checked on one another. Families stayed connected. Citizens reported suspicious activity. Volunteers assisted authorities. Local organizations provided support where they could. The violence created fear, but also created solidarity. People recognize that surviving a crisis often requires collective effort. No individual could stop the terror alone, but communities working together could endure it. That lesson remains relevant long after the case itself faded from daily headlines. Because crises change form, different generations face different threats.